Chapter 14 of Army Boys on the Firing Line, or Holding Back the German Drive, by Homer Randall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For more information, or to learn how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 14. The Storm of War. "Listen to that music," said Frank to his comrades the next morning, as a furious cannonade opened up that made the ground shake and filled the air with flying missiles of death. "Too many bass notes in it to be real good music," remarked Billy with a grin. "Maybe it's the overture just before the rising of the curtain," suggested Bart. "Perhaps it is," agreed Frank. "The Hun has got to start his drive sometime, and this would be just the kind of morning for it. See how heavy that mist lies on the ground? We couldn't see the Germans at a distance of 50 yards. "That's mighty thick for a fact," observed Bart. "But I guess our advanced posts are on the job. They'll give us warning in plenty of time." "Not that we need much warning as far as I can see," said Billy. "We've been ready for a long time to fight at the drop of a hat. I'll bet the Hun doesn't carry a foot of our line." "That's where you're wrong, Billy, old scout," warned Bart. "It stands to reason that he'll get away with something at first. You take any one man, no matter how strong he is, and if 10 fellows rush him all at once, they're bound to drive him back at the start. The Huns have got the advantage of knowing where they're going to strike. We don't know, and so we have to spread our forces out so as to be ready to meet him at any point. Then, too, the man who comes rushing in has the advantage of the fellow who's standing still because he's got momentum. That's why generals would rather fight on the offensive than on the defensive. They're able to pick the time and place, and the other fellow has to follow his lead." "I don't see why the Allies can't take the offensive," grumbled Billy. "It gets my goat to let the Huns hit first." "It does mine, too," admitted Frank. "And if it hadn't been for Russia quitting, we'd be looking now at the coattails of the Kaiser's generals as they scooted back to Berlin. But that's a bit of hard luck that we can't help. Russia's back down has taken 10 million soldiers from the Allies' strength. But America will make that all up in time, and then you'll see us doing the chasing." "It can't come too soon to suit me," said Billy. "I only wish Uncle Sam had started sooner to get ready." "So do I," replied Frank. "But there's no use crying over spilt milk. We're getting ahead now with leaps and bounds. I was talking to Will Stone the other day, and he just got back from a flying trip to one of the French seaports. He says it simply knocked him stiff to see the transports coming in, loaded to the guards with American troops. And he says the roads are fairly choked with doughboys moving this way. They're coming like a swarm of locusts, and there's millions more where they came from. Oh, Uncle Sam is awake now, all right, and don't you forget it. And when he once gets started, there's nothing on earth can stop him." "Right you are," said Bart. "We've won every war we've ever been in, and it's got to be a habit," grinned Billy. The old 37th was stationed on the second line, or what is called in military terms, the line of resistance. In modern fighting, when a heavy attack is expected, the defending army is usually arranged in 3 lines. The first is the advanced line, and this is hardly expected to be held very long. Its chief aim is to hold back the enemy for a while and weaken him as far as possible. Not many troops are employed on this line, nor many big guns. The chief reliance is on rifle fire and machine guns, which are so placed as to deliver a withering crossfire and cut up the enemy divisions. By the time the first line is driven back, the defending army knows where the enemy has chosen to strike and is ready for him on the second line, or line of resistance. Here the battle is on in all its fury. If here again the enemy advances, there is still a third line of battle positions. This is practically the last entrenched position that the defenders have. If they are driven back from this into the open country beyond, it becomes a serious thing for the retreating army, as many of their big guns will have been lost, and their forces are apt to be more or less disorganized, while the enemy is flushed with the victory he has so far gained. The cannonade kept on with increasing fury all through the early morning. "Heine must have plenty of ammunition," remarked Frank. "He's spending it freely." "It beats anything we've been up against since we came to the front," observed Billy. "It seems to be coming nearer and nearer all the time," said Bart. "I guess this is going to be our busy day." There was intense activity all through the lines. Orderlies galloped from place to place with orders. Big motor cars rumbled up, loaded with troops who were hastily placed in position. The big guns of the Allied forces had opened up and were sending back shell for shell over the enemy lines. For over 2 hours the artillery kept up the titanic duel. The fog was lifting, though still heavy in some of the low-lying sections. The 37th was resting easily on its arms, ready for whatever might happen. "We may not see so much fighting after all," remarked Billy after a while. "The fellows in front seem to be holding pretty well. Perhaps they'll throw the Huns back right from the start." "Don't kid yourself," replied Frank grimly. "That first line is almost sure to go. It's expected to. It's only a forlorn hope anyway. We'll get our stomachs full of fighting before the day is over." Even while he spoke, there were signs of confusion up in front. Groups of men came in sight, evidently retreating. Machine-gun crews, bringing their weapons with them, were hurriedly setting them up in new positions. There would be a few discharges, and then they would be forced to retreat still further. They were fighting splendidly and putting up a dogged resistance, yielding ground only foot by foot, but to the experienced eyes of the boys there was no mistaking the signs. The enemy had broken through the first line of positions. "Well, it's nothing more than we knew would happen," remarked Frank, as his frame tingled with the excitement of the coming fight, which he knew would soon be upon him. "That's so," agreed Bart. "But what gets me is that the line was broken so quickly. I thought it would be afternoon at least before the Huns got as far as this." The lines opened up to let the newcomers through so that they could go to the rear and reform. "How about it?" Frank asked of a machine gunner whom he knew, as the man limped by him, supported by a comrade. "We didn't expect to see you fellers so soon." "It was the mist," was the reply. "The Huns got within 30 yards before we tumbled to it. We did the best we could, but they just swamped our position before we could get our crossfire going. Even at that we mowed 'em down in heaps with our rifle fire, but they kept on coming. For every dead man there were 20 live ones to take his place. We put up a stiff fight, but there were too many of 'em. It seemed like millions. They're coming now like a house afire, and you boys want to brace." "We're braced already," muttered Billy through his clenched teeth as he gripped his rifle until it seemed as though his fingers must leave their imprint on the stock. There was a short period of waiting, more trying by far than any actual fighting. Then the storm broke. In front of them, rank after rank of gray-clad troops came in sight, stretching back as far as the eye could see. The mist had wholly vanished now, and the boys could see their enemy. It seemed as though the machine gunner had not exaggerated when he said that there were millions. They were like the waves of the sea. But the stout hearts of the American boys never quailed. Time and again they had met these men, or their fellows, and driven them back at the point of the bayonet. They had outfought and outgamed them. They had sent them flying before them. They had seen their backs. The blood of heroes and of patriots ran in the veins of the defenders. Their ancestors had fought at Bunker Hill, at Palo Alto, at Gettysburg. Above them floated the Stars and Stripes, an unstained flag, A glorious flag, a flag that had never been smirched by defeat. Their eyes blazed and their muscles stiffened. Then, like an avalanche, the enemy struck. End of chapter 14 of Army Boys on the Firing Line. The Storm of War by Homer Randall.
Birds as Messengers, from Birds and the War by Hugh H. Gladstone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Birds as Messengers. In the pigeon post, we have the most obvious example of service rendered to man by birds during the war. The homing pigeon, whose speed of flight has been estimated at from 880 to 2,000 yards per minute, according to weather conditions, has naturally played an important part. The first use of pigeons as message carriers is wrapped in the mystery of antiquity. Solomon is alleged to have transmitted orders throughout his kingdom by means of homing pigeons. The ancient Greeks, Egyptians, and Romans employed these birds in their armies, and the victory at the siege of Modena, 43 B.C., has been attributed to pigeons. After the conquest of Gaul, relays of pigeons carried the news to Rome, as in later days the news of the victory at Waterloo was brought to England by pigeons some days in advance of the official courier. Country Life, January 4, 1919. In the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, they were extensively used, and in the South African War of 1899 to 1902, they were also employed. Owing to the advent of wireless telegraphy, it was decided by the Admiralty in 1918 that the naval pigeon service was obsolete, and the government pigeons were therefore disposed of. Referee, December 22, 1918. At the beginning of the war, the British authorities took a characteristic course in dealing with these birds. They ordered the internment or destruction of all pigeons along the coast. Thousands of lives of men depended upon the reversal of that edict and upon the use, instead of slaughter, of the birds. The minesweepers were the first to realize the existence of a means of communication possible where all others failed, and an emergency pigeon service was established through private owners, by means of which minesweepers were enabled to send information to shore of large minefields newly laid, and other dangers of the sea. Bird Notes and News, Volume 8, page 25. Gradually it was recognized that pigeons would prove of great military importance. Steps were taken to set up an effective carrier service. Pigeon fanciers came forward with the utmost patriotism to present their birds, and a little later severe penalties were enforced under DORA for shooting carrier pigeons. It was even held that it was the duty of the public, in their own interest, to feed, water, and care for any stray homers which might come into their possession. Daily Express, July 18, 1918. In spite of these precautions, several fell victims during the shoots organized in this country to thin the immigrant hordes of wood pigeons. Our military pigeon service under Captain A.H. Osman grew to large proportions, and though it was not till March 1916 that the first British pigeons were sent over to the Western Front, our birds soon became as useful to us as those employed by our allies in France and Belgium, in which latter country the training and rearing of pigeons has long ranked as a national sport. In the earlier days, old omnibuses were used as traveling lofts, but later on, up-to-date motor lofts were extensively employed. The pigeons were taken by bicyclists in wicker crates to the front-line trenches, where they proved of the greatest use, particularly when the telegraph and telephone wires had been cut by shell fire, and when it became impossible for the intrepid runners to bring back messages on foot. Pigeon post messages, when written and folded, are carried in a cup placed in a small cylindrical carrier of aluminum clipped to the bird's leg. The pigeon, on returning to one of the latest type of lofts, hearing its mate calling inside, finds its way to a ledge under the window fitted with hinged wires that only open inwards. Pushing through these, the bird's weight presses on the lightly balanced interior platform, completing an electric circuit and so ringing a bell, which warns the attendant in his dugout of the arrival of a messenger. Some of the longest distances flown in the war were 300 miles, and one female pigeon flew 166 sea miles 3 weeks in succession with dispatches from the North Sea. Usually the birds fly these long distances about once a week, but they require rest after them. It has been calculated that as many as 100,000 pigeons were employed by the British forces during the war, and their demobilization was announced in January 1919. Daily News, January 22, 1919. In November 1914, the German invaders of France issued orders by which it was expressly forbidden to keep live pigeons of any breed, and a penalty of 50 francs for each bird was imposed. The wretched inhabitants reluctantly killed all the birds they could, but many escaped and were driven to the fields. Here they were shot at by any passing German soldier, and if they alighted on some peasant's roof, they were driven off with volleys of stones for fear of incurring the penalty of the fine. Pigeons had a hard time of it. It has been estimated that 1 million Belgian pigeons were stolen by the Germans during their occupation. Just before the armistice, some 25,000 were taken, of which only 5,000 were found at Spandau. Little hope is entertained of recovering the remainder of the missing birds, which are believed to have been killed and eaten by hungry German soldiers. Daily Express, January 25, 1919. Although on the continent spies were arrested for making use of this medium to convey messages, no such cases appear to have been reported in this country. In this connection, it is amusing to note that the recovery of birds ringed for the investigation of migration was often regarded as suspicious. A black-headed gull, ringed M. Viborg, Denmark, which was shot in Suffolk in December 1916, was forwarded to the military authorities, who passed the ring to the Admiralty with the following comment: "This looks as if addressee had been trying to train a gull as a carrier to England. This has often been tried, but is generally considered unreliable." Homing pigeons were extensively used by our fleet, and it is recorded that skipper Thomas Crisp, V.C., who died at the wheel under fire from a German submarine, lived long enough to dispatch a message by pigeon. Through the timely arrival of the bird, his son and crew were saved. An RAF seaplane patrolling over the North Sea made a forced descent and was in danger of being dashed to pieces by the heavy sea. The airmen released a pigeon with a message asking for immediate help, and in 22 minutes the bird reached its loft 22 miles distant. Help was at once sent, and the airmen were found clinging to the wreckage of the machine, which was rapidly breaking up. Daily Mail, September 30th, 1918. A touching story is told by a Canadian, Flight Commander R. Leckie, DSO, in a letter home published in an American newspaper. After an engagement with hostile aircraft over the North Sea, he came down, his seaplane riddled with shrapnel, over 50 miles from land, and then had to act as rescuer and host to the crew of an aeroplane wrecked by engine failure. 6 men were thus adrift in a doomed machine, with no food and little water. The commander had 4 pigeons. One was released at once, a second on the next day, a third on the third day. All failed to reach home, perishing over the waste of waters. The fourth, set free in a fog, hungry and thirsty, struggled over the 50 miles of sea without a landmark and without a rest. The bird could not reach his loft, but fluttered down in a Coast Guard station, and there fell dead from exhaustion, but his message was delivered, and 6 men were saved. Bird Notes and News, Volume 8, page 26. A pigeon sent on a seaplane carrying out duties in the North Sea brought back the message, "Attacked." The observer had not time to write more, and the bird itself, shot through the left eye by a bullet during the encounter which resulted in the loss of the seaplane, only just managed to struggle to its loft. It was promptly pensioned off war service and became the pet of the aerodrome. Daily Chronicle, September 11th, 1918. Pigeons once wounded while serving their country were not allowed again on duty. They were fed on the best and became perfectly tame, answering to such names as Haig, Kitchener, and Amiens. Daily Mirror, September 20th, 1918. Homers were taken up in airplanes and tossed with messages from behind the German lines. Advantage was also taken of the fact that behind the German lines there were large towns or thickly populated areas occupied by a friendly people, many of whom, moreover, knew all about homing pigeons, as the north of France and Belgium, like Yorkshire and Lancashire, were centres of the fancy. By a combination of close meteorological study and ingenious mechanical devices, it became possible to drop baskets containing our pigeons on occupied areas where the chances were that they would fall into friendly hands. These hands knew where to take them, and in due course a large percentage arrived at our lofts bearing valuable information. Times, December 30th, 1918. Pigeons were also made use of for counter-espionage. The Germans made a splendidly finished message carrier with a red seal at the top. From time to time our troops captured German pigeons in the trenches, but could not use them to send messages, as they had no similar holders. A medal maker of Birmingham, however, imitated the well-made German holder so perfectly that it was impossible to tell those he made from the captured original. Thereafter a number of dud messages were sent to German lofts with their own birds. Daily Mail, April 9th, 1919. In Italy, on at least one occasion, a pigeon post message brought the news that an Austrian convoy was moving in front of the British lines. An aeroplane was at once dispatched and completely disorganized the convoy. Daily Mail, June 26, 1918. A company of French troops, cut off from their fellows by a curtain of fire at Verdun, owed their deliverance to a homing pigeon. New York American, April 28, 1918. One of the most important factors in the defense in the eastern Champagne, on July 15, 1918, was the smooth working of the information service under the German bombardment. Each pillbox fort in the covering zone was supplied with a crate of carrier pigeons, and the birds brought back news of every movement of the enemy and every phase of the fight to the command posts. One officer commander, with experience of intelligence work, interrogated German prisoners who were brought into his pillbox as they arrived, and dispatched the information derived from the bewildered Germans by columbogram almost as quickly as it could have been sent by telegram. In another case, the garrison of a pillbox sent back by pigeon a request that artillery should immediately open on the ground around their stronghold, taking no thought for their own safety, as the Germans were about to surround them. Morning Post, July 19, 1918. The officer who commanded the 1st Tank Corps Battalion stated that pigeons had frequently saved the situation for him. Neither a gas cloud nor a heavy barrage of artillery fire deterred these messengers from bringing their dispatches. The Battle of Monchy is alleged to have been won through a flying message to the troops at the base. A counterattack at Arras was smashed by the same means. Bird Notes and News, Volume 8, page 25. Although the homing pigeons on the Western Front were of the greatest use, as many as 1,000 birds being sometimes employed in a single engagement, Their value was not always properly estimated. There is a story that when pressed hard to find a dinner for his master, a faithful batman served up what he simply described as a brace of birds. They proved excellent eating, but a subsequent inquiry from headquarters as to the loss of 2 valuable homing pigeons led to investigations. The batman eventually revealed the origin of the dainty dish to his master, and after being warned that if found out it would certainly mean a court-martial, was asked if he had left any evidence, such as the basket, to which he replied, "Couldn't cook 'em without making a fire, sir." Daily Mail, February 3, 1919. The men to whom the carrier pigeons were consigned occasionally became bored by their precious charges. One day a practice pigeon message was received from a somewhat fed-up Australian battalion, rather weary of sending practice pigeon messages during many weeks. The latest message, when decoded, read thus: "In view of the shortage of paper, what about crossing these birds with cockatoos and teaching them to deliver verbal messages?" Globe, May 31, 1918. On another occasion, during an engagement on a big scale, a certain headquarters staff was very anxiously awaiting news. For a long while none came. Then a pigeon flew into sight, circled several times, and alighted on a roof. A man was sent to catch it. He brought down the packet containing the message. The staff gathered round the officer who took the message. They listened with intense eagerness to learn the news. What the officer read out was, "I am fed up with this blasted bird." Daily Mail, March 14, 1918. This story, when brought to the attention of the War Office, provoked an encomium of our pigeon service, which, it was said by the officer in charge, had proved invaluable, the birds frequently homing through gas clouds and barrage after all other means of communication had failed. All the birds were presented to the service from the finest strains of long-distance pedigree stock, and the majority of men in charge of them were lifelong fanciers devoted to the work. In one of the greatest battles where pigeons were largely used, 100% of the messages were delivered under the most difficult circumstances, and it was stated authoritatively that thousands of lives had been saved by pigeons homing from seaplanes or minesweepers in distress. Daily Mail, March 22, 1918. Admiralty records showed that 95% of the several thousand pigeons employed in the Naval Pigeon Service came through with their messages. Daily Mail and Daily Chronicle, May 7, 1918. The pigeons of the Royal Air Force, up till the end of 1918, had brought no fewer than 717 messages of distress from aircraft down on the surface of the water. In carrying these messages, the birds covered an aggregate of 20,000 miles. Referee, December 22, 1918. The Germans erected special gas-proof coats for their pigeons and went so far as to camouflage their birds by giving them a coat of paint. A message taken from one of these German pigeons pays our troops a backhanded compliment. Field Battery No. 36. Our telephone is out of order. Send us at once reinforcements. These accursed Englishmen keep us busy. Miller, 1st Lieutenant. Daily Mail, April 5, 1916. By observation plus instinct, most of our birds rapidly learned their route from the trenches. Though shy at first, the pigeons got wise to shell fire, and old birds made away from the dugouts with knowing swiftness. Pigeons proved hardy and recovered from exposure to gas. They were rarely shot dead while flying, and birds with shrapnel in the breast or with broken beaks gamely tried to carry their missives home. In the action which was fought in the region of the Menin Road on October 3, 1917, a pigeon, number 2709, was dispatched with a message from the front line to divisional headquarters at 1:30 p.m. During its passage, it was struck by a German bullet, which broke one of its legs, denuding the bone, the tibia, of all flesh, and drove the metal cylinder containing the message into the side of its body, the bullet passing out of its back. In spite of its wounds, and although out in the wet all night, the bird struggled home to its loft, a distance of 9 miles, and delivered its message at 10:53 a.m. the following day, October 4th, dying shortly after its arrival. The Field, February 2nd, 1918. The bird has now been added to the Museum of the Royal United Service Institution, Whitehall, where it may be seen stuffed in a glass case labeled "Died of wounds received in action." Daily Mail, July 25, 1918. Had the feat of this pigeon been performed by a human being, it might well have been rewarded by the Victoria Cross. It is impossible to estimate the value of the carrier service to the naval, military, and air forces. Not only were our pigeons extensively employed on the Western Front, but also at Salonika, in Italy, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and elsewhere, and on innumerable occasions they carried life and death messages with superhuman pluck and perseverance. Doubtless our enemies would speak as highly of the services of their homers. A German pigeon loft with 35 pigeons, captured by the Canadians at Folly near Arras on August 9, 1918, was presented to the Zoological Society of London in October. The 2 Germans in charge of the loft attempted, on the near approach of the Canadians, to burn it, but our men quickly dispatched the Germans and extinguished the flames. The marks of the fire, however, remain, and several bullet holes may be seen penetrating the outside frame of the loft. Times, November 2, 1918. In March 1918, when everyone was invited to invest their money in war bonds, an additional attraction was afforded by the Pigeon Post Service, which carried messages from the investor's home to the Tank Bank in Trafalgar Square, notifying the amount of the investment. Queen Alexandra's pigeon attracted a crowd of people to the Mobile loft when the bird arrived within a minute from Marlborough House with the announcement that Her Majesty wished to purchase 500 war savings certificates on behalf of the Queen Alexandra League. Globe, March 4, 1918. In America, the Homer was likened to the dove sent out from the Ark of Noah, which brought wanted news then. So do the carrier pigeons of the war zone bring their messages now. New York American, April 28, 1918. A recruiting message from Lady Reading was carried in May 1918 from Washington by 3 carrier pigeons to New York, where it was read at a mass meeting under the auspices of the British and Canadian Recruiting Committee. The Times, May 30, 1918. In the pageant of the Lord Mayor's show of 1918, a traveling pigeon loft took part in the procession to remind the public of the splendid achievements performed by members of the carrier pigeon service, which has been not inaptly dubbed the First Flying Corps. Bird Notes and News, Volume 8, page 25. Before April 1919, the demobilization of the pigeons and their attendants in France had taken place, with the exception of birds and men selected for the Army of Occupation. Some 9,000 to 10,000 birds that had served their country well had to be disposed of. They would have been a drug on the English market if they had been sent home, and the cost of the transaction would probably have been more than the birds would have realized. They were therefore sold at Courtrai, Lille, and other places in France and Belgium, and the proceeds of the sale divided among charitable institutions in accordance with the wish of the breeders who gave the birds to the country for the war. Daily Mail, April 9, 1919. The homing pigeon has been ridiculously libeled during the war, for no spy melodrama or novelette has been complete without one or more of these attractive birds, which are invariably represented as working for the Germans. Ever since the original war story of the market woman of Armentières, or Arras, or Rheims, it is told by veracious eyewitnesses of all these towns and many more, whose figure attracted the attention of the alert soldiery, and whose bust flew away when they arrested her, The homing pigeon has labored under a load of suspicion. Daily Express, May 15, 1918. As a matter of fact, it may safely be said that His Majesty had no more devoted, though unwitting, servant than the homing pigeons of his army and navy. It is of interest to note that parrots were employed early in the war at the Eiffel Tower to announce the approach of hostile aircraft. It was found at first that the birds gave warning fully 20 minutes before an aeroplane or airship could be identified by the eye or heard by the human ear. The birds, however, which could never be trained to discriminate between a French and a German aeroplane, appear to have grown indifferent or bored, so that they ceased to be trustworthy. Daily Mail, February 1st, 1918. It is well known that canaries, being about 15 times more sensitive than a man to poisonous gases, are used in mines and in mining disasters to test atmospheric conditions and save miners or explorers from gas poisoning. The Government Mines Committee recommended that 2 or 3 birds should be kept at rescue stations for the testing for carbon monoxide. Our soldiers on the Western Front are said on one occasion to have been warned by the behavior of wild birds in the night of a coming attack of poisonous gas. Before the smell of the fumes could be perceived in the trenches, the soldiers were awakened to their danger by the noise of birds which had detected the first fumes of the vile infection. Bird Notes and News, Volume 6, page 102. Canaries and other cage birds were extensively used by both our own and the German miners at the front when tunneling to detect the presence of subterranean gas. Daily Mail, May 29, 1918. A soldier writing of his company's canary says, "Many were the nights on which he was rudely disturbed from his slumbers, dumped unceremoniously into a sandbag, and carried through rain and snow up to the trenches. Here he would do his job underground, and as often as not reach the surface again, a limp little form lying at the bottom of his cage. He never failed us, though." Bird Notes and News, Volume 8, page 26. In many cases, the canaries, issued as tests for the presence of poisonous gas, were made pets of by our soldiers, and placed by them in the safest places. Daily Mail, April 10, 1919. Hundreds of enemy canaries were killed by our shell and gas, but those that were rescued by our troops were, needless to say, well cared for. A demonstration of their utility was given to the members of the Congress of Southeastern Scientific Societies on June 1, 1918, when a bird in a cage was introduced into a chamber full of poison gas and became unconscious before a human being exposed to the same conditions showed any signs of being affected. Sunday Herald, June 2, 1918. This wartime use of canaries may have been one of the reasons which caused a canary boom in America, where these birds are very popular. Although double the pre-war price would willingly have been paid, the birds were unprocurable, German-bred birds being out of the market, and the majority of the Norwich fanciers having joined the colors, the demand proved far greater than the supply. Daily Mail, May 8, 1916. It is horrible to think of canaries being stifled by poison gas. And the following verses, "To a Canary in a Trench," may here be quoted. "Bonjour, merry bird, your bonny life we ask, that we may know when gases blow, and spring to don our mask. We would that we might mask you too, so beautiful, so fair. You sing today your roundelay, and love is everywhere. Bonsoir, merry bird, in war you've played your part, nor knew that death was in the breath that stilled your little heart. Your perch swings idly in your cage, unscathed we march along. So may we learn, if fortune turn, to greet death with a song." Life, November 14, 1918, page 700. It is consoling to learn that canaries were also used in ambulance trains to cheer our wounded soldiers with their sweet song. Sporting and Dramatic News, June 8, 1918. Seagulls, on more than one occasion, betrayed the presence of submarines and floating mines to anxious mariners. A French writer, Monsieur Louis Rousseau, claimed them as one of our most precious auxiliaries, who had at all times indicated to our fishermen the presence of shoals of fish, and who, when our boats and their crews were mobilized and fished for mines and submarines, imitated them and continued their service of intelligence. Bulletin de la SFPO, June 1918. A pilot reported that while in the Channel on January 5, 1918, he noticed some seagulls sitting upon a floating object. Upon closer investigation, he saw it was a mine with 5 prongs. On top of each prong was perched a seagull. He just had time to alter the ship's course slightly and thus averted disaster. Observer, January 6, 1918. A somewhat similar story is told by an officer on board a ship in the North Sea. While watching a puffin through my glasses, I suddenly saw the periscope of a German submarine appear above the water close to the bird. We altered our course just in time to evade by a few feet 2 torpedoes which were fired at us. We tried to ram the submarine, but unfortunately she dived too quickly. Ibis, 1917, page 34. The fact that seagulls were attracted by the periscope of an enemy submarine aroused the ingenuity of no less a savant than Samuel Pepys, Jr., who suggested that it be ordered in the fleet that all seagulls around our ships be fed daily with herrings from an underwater boat, so that whenever they shall observe any such boat, they shall assuredly flock over it for herrings, and so its presence be made known, being that these birds can see to a great depth below the water, and so keen of sight as to discern a sprat 5 fathoms below the surface. Truth, February 25, 1915. The suggestion made by Punch that parrots should be used for propaganda work, both in this country and in Germany, the propagandists abroad to be crossed with British homing pigeons, Punch, March 27, 1918, only aimed at the humorous. A scheme was, however, sent in all seriousness to the War Inventions Board by a man who had noticed that birds peck mortar. He suggested that a flock of cormorants should be trained to feed by putting their food in lines against a wall, so that they might associate these lines with their food. They should then be taken to Essen, where they would attack the chimneys at Krupp's works with such vigor as to destroy them. Daily Mail, January 13th, 1916. End of Birds as Messengers, from Birds and the War by Hugh H. Gladstone, read by Maria Kasper.
The Story of the Great War, Volume 8. Edited by Francis J. Reynolds, Alan L. Churchill, and Francis T. Miller. Chapter 15 of Part 4, The Great War's End. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to learn how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 15. Austria-Hungary and Germany surrender. The war thus comes to an end. The sustained success of the Allied armies in France and Belgium in August and September of 1918 strengthened the determination of the Allies not to relax any efforts to prosecute the war to a victorious conclusion. The Central Powers were no less impressed with the trend of events, and throughout September and October, repeated efforts were made by Austria-Hungary and by Germany to induce President Wilson to take the first steps toward an armistice and peace. The President made it clear that the United States would urge no course upon the Allies that might in any way sacrifice the military advantage their armies had gained. It became more and more evident that the terms of armistice and peace would be dictated by the Allies. That Germany was quite as anxious to bring about a speedy armistice as Austria-Hungary was expressed in a note which the Washington government received on October 30, 1918, and which the State Department declined to make public because it was evident that the document had been prepared mainly for propaganda purposes. The note described the various steps that had been taken to democratize the German government with the view to impressing the United States that they had complied with President Wilson's stand not to discuss an armistice with a nation that was still dominated by an autocracy. The note endeavored to prove that the German people were now in complete control of the government, but it failed to impress the administration, since it did not show any change in the situation created by other German proposals to suspend hostilities. The evident purpose of the appeal was to influence sentiment in foreign countries and gain sympathy in the United States. It was well understood at Washington and in the capitals of the Allies that the Central Powers realized that they faced complete disaster, and that their only hope of saving anything from the wreck was to bring about a speedy cessation of hostilities. On October 31, 1918, the representatives of the Entente Powers assembled at Versailles to consider the terms of the armistice after an informal meeting at the home of Colonel E. M. House, President Wilson's personal representative. On this date, Turkey capitulated. The United States had no part in arranging the Turkish armistice, which was chiefly the work of the British and French representatives. The principal terms of the armistice granted by the Allies to Turkey were the opening of the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, and access to the Black Sea and occupation of all forts along these waters by the Allies. All Allied prisoners of war and Armenian interned persons and prisoners to be collected in Constantinople and handed over unconditionally to the Allies. Immediate demobilization of the Turkish army, except such as were required to guard frontiers and maintain internal order. The surrender of all war vessels in Turkish waters or waters occupied by Turkey. Free use by Allied ships of all ports and anchorages now in Turkish occupation, and denial of their use by the enemy. Wireless, cable, and telegraph stations to be controlled by the Allies. The surrender of all garrisons in Hejaz, Yemen, Mesopotamia, etc. All Germans and Austrians, naval, military, or civilians, to be evacuated within 1 month from Turkish dominions. The capitulation of Turkey, though anticipated for some days by the Entente and the United States, was important inasmuch as it was expected to hasten the collapse of the Central Powers. Austria, aflame with anarchy and with revolutionary mobs parading the capital, had no choice but to submit to the Allies' terms. In Washington, the complete collapse and unconditional surrender of Germany was hourly expected. All interest was now centered in the Supreme War Council in session at Versailles, where the terms to be offered to the Central Powers were under discussion. There were present during the deliberations General Tasker H. Bliss, representing the United States, Premier Clemenceau, Marshal Foch, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, Colonel E.M. House, President Wilson's personal representative, and David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. It was decided that the terms to be submitted to Germany should be confined strictly to military requirements conditioned generally upon President Wilson's principles. During the discussion of Austrian questions, Serbian and Greek representatives were present because of their special interest in Austrian affairs. At Washington, President Wilson kept in touch with the United States representatives at the Versailles Council. Colonel House advised the President of the progress of the deliberations, and there were frequent exchanges of communications. It was known in Washington that the political and economic conditions in the Central Powers had reached such a pass that Austria could not, and Germany would not, refuse to sign any terms which the Entente was prepared to offer. The complete destruction of the Austrian armies by the Italians, which resulted in the capture of over 300,000 prisoners and 5,000 guns, left the dual monarchy no alternative but complete surrender. On November 3, 1918, an armistice with Austria was signed by General Diaz, the Italian commander-in-chief, which went into operation at 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the following day. The principal terms in the armistice may be briefly outlined. Demobilization of the Austro-Hungarian army and withdrawal of all forces operating on the front from the North Sea to Switzerland. Half the divisional corps and army artillery and equipment to be collected at points indicated by the Allies and the United States for delivery to them. Evacuation of all territories invaded by Austria-Hungary since the beginning of the war. The Allies to have the right of free movement over all roads, railroads, and waterways in Austro-Hungarian territory. The armies of the Allies to occupy such strategic points as they deemed necessary to conduct military operations or to maintain order. Complete evacuation of all German troops within 15 days from Italian and Balkan fronts and all Austro-Hungarian territory. Evacuated territories to be governed by local authorities under control of the Allied armies of occupation. Immediate reparation without reciprocity of all Allied prisoners of war and civil populations evacuated from their homes. The naval conditions included surrender to the Allies and the United States of 15 submarines and all German submarines in Austrian waters, 3 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 9 destroyers, 6 Danube monitors, etc. Freedom of navigation for the Allies in the Adriatic and all waterways, with occupation of forts and defenses on the Danube. The existing blockade conditions to remain unchanged, and all naval aircraft to be concentrated and impractionized in Austro-Hungarian bases to be designated by the Allies and the United States of America. The drastic character of the armistice terms were calculated to please even the bitter enders in America and Europe. President Wilson's diplomacy was now triumphantly vindicated, and those members of Congress who had found fault with his note-writing were ready to concede that to him belonged a great deal of the credit of bringing about a situation that must lead to the ending of the war on the Allies' own terms. On November 6, 1918, the German government sent a wireless message to Marshal Foch asking him to receive German plenipotentiaries who would arrive at the French outposts on the following day, November 7, to arrange for the armistice. The mission was headed by Matthias Erzberger, Secretary of State, and included General von Winterfeldt, Count Alfred von Oberndorf, General von Grunel, and Naval Captain von Sallow. As previously noted in the last chapter devoted to military operations, the armistice was signed by the German representatives and all hostilities ceased on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m. On the same date, President Wilson announced the terms of the armistice in his address to Congress. Briefly summarized, Germany agreed to the immediate evacuation of all invaded countries, including Alsace-Lorraine, and yielded over to Allied occupation the countries on the left bank of the Rhine, including control of the crossings of that river at Mayence, Koblenz, and Cologne, bridgeheads of 30-kilometer radius on the eastern bank, and the establishment of a neutral zone from 30 to 40 kilometers in breadth and running from the frontier of Holland to the Swiss frontier. Germany surrendered about half her navy, including 160 submarines, which passed at once under control of the Allies to be disarmed and interned in Allied or neutral ports. All other German warships were to be disarmed and concentrated in German naval bases and held under the control of the Allies in the United States. All the railways of Belgium, Luxembourg, and of Alsace-Lorraine, with their equipment, were to be given up. In the east, Germany abandoned the treaties of Bucharest and Brest-Litovsk. All German troops in Russia, Romania, or Turkey were to be withdrawn, and the agents of German propaganda recalled. The Baltic was open to the warships of the Allies, and provision was made that through Danzig, or the Vistula, supplies might be sent to the starving peoples of Poland and Russia. The Black Sea ports were also to be evacuated by Germany, and she must give up the Russian fleet. While the blockade was to be maintained as respected Germany, all German restriction upon trade of neutrals was removed. Germany must give up all prisoners she had taken, all the ships she had seized, but this was not reciprocal. German prisoners of war and German ships remained in the custody of the Allies. While President Wilson was reading to the assembled Congress the drastic terms which Germany had been forced to accept in order to obtain peace, there was a tense silence on the part of the great audience. It was only when they realized, as paragraph after paragraph was read, how complete the victory of the Allies was, that faint hand-clapping was heard. Then cheers, and presently everyone in the gallery and on the floor was on his feet, cheering madly. After reading the terms of the armistice, President Wilson continued, "The war thus comes to an end. For having accepted these terms of armistice, it will be impossible for the German command to renew it." End of the Story of the Great War, Volume 8. Edited by Francis J. Reynolds, Alan L. Churchill, and Francis T. Miller. Chapter 15 of Part 4. The Great War's End.
Statement to the Court upon being convicted of violating the Sedition Act by Eugene V. Debs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. September 18, 1918. Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. I listened to all that was said in this court in support and justification of this prosecution, but my mind remains unchanged. I look upon the Espionage Act as a despotic enactment and flagrant conflict with democratic principles and with the spirit of free institutions. Your Honor, I have stated in this court that I am opposed to the social system in which we live, that I believe in a fundamental change, but if possible, by peaceable and orderly means. Standing here this morning, I recall my boyhood. At 14, I went to work in a railroad shop. At 16, I was firing a freight engine on a railroad. I remember all the hardships and privations of that earlier day, and from that time until now my heart has been with the working class. I could have been in Congress long ago. I have preferred to go to prison. I am thinking this morning of the men in the mills and the factories, of the men in the mines and on the railroads. I am thinking of the women who for a paltry wage are compelled to work out their barren lives, of the little children who in this system are robbed of their childhood and in their tender years are seized in the remorseless grasp of mammon and forced into the industrial dungeons, there to feed the monster machines while they themselves are being starved and stunted, body and soul. I see them dwarfed and diseased, and their little lives broken and blasted, because in this high noon of Christian civilization, money is still so much more important than the flesh and blood of childhood. In very truth, gold is God today, and rules with pitiless sway in the affairs of men. In this country, the most favored beneath the bending skies, we have vast areas of the richest and most fertile soil, material resources in inexhaustible abundance, the most marvelous productive machinery on earth, and millions of eager workers ready to apply their labor to that machinery to produce an abundance for every man, woman, and child. And if there are still vast numbers of our people who are the victims of poverty, and whose lives are an unceasing struggle all the way from youth to old age, until at last death comes to their rescue and lulls these hapless victims to dreamless sleep, it is not the fault of the Almighty. It cannot be charged to nature, but it is due entirely to the outgrown social system in which we live that ought to be abolished, not only in the interest of the toiling masses, but in the higher interest of all humanity. I believe, Your Honor, in common with all socialists, that this nation ought to own and control its own industries. I believe, as all socialists do, that all things that are jointly needed and used ought to be jointly owned, that industry, the basis of our social life, instead of being the private property of a few and operated for their enrichment, ought to be the common property of all, democratically administered in the interest of all. I am opposing a social order in which it is possible for one man who does absolutely nothing that is useful to amass a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars, while millions of men and women who work all the days of their lives secure barely enough for a wretched existence. This order of things cannot always endure. I have registered my protest against it. I recognize the feebleness of my effort, but fortunately I am not alone. There are multiplied thousands of others who, like myself, have come to realize that before we may truly enjoy the blessings of civilized life, we must reorganize society upon a mutual and cooperative basis, and to this end we have organized a great economic and political movement that spreads over the face of all the earth. There are today upwards of 60 millions of socialists, loyal, devoted adherents to this cause, regardless of nationality, race, creed, color, or sex. They are all making common cause. They are spreading with tireless energy the propaganda of the new social order. They are waiting, watching, and working, hopefully, through all the hours of the day and the night. They are still in a minority, but they have learned how to be patient and to bide their time. They feel, they know indeed, that the time is coming, in spite of all opposition, all persecution, when this emancipating gospel will spread among all the peoples, and when this minority will become the triumphant majority, and sweeping into power, inaugurate the greatest social and economic change in history. In that day, we shall have the universal commonwealth, the harmonious cooperation of every nation with every other nation on earth. Your Honor, I ask no mercy, and I plead for no immunity. I realize that finally the right must prevail. I never so clearly comprehended as now the great struggle between the powers of greed and exploitation on the one hand, and upon the other the rising hosts of industrial freedom and social justice. I can see the dawn of the better day for humanity. The people are awakening. In due time, they will and must come to their own. When the mariner, sailing over tropic seas, looks for relief from his weary watch, he turns his eyes toward the Southern Cross, burning luridly above the tempest-vexed ocean. As the midnight approaches, the Southern Cross begins to bend. The whirling worlds change their places, and with starry finger-points the Almighty marks the passage of time upon the dial of the universe. And though no bell may beat the glad tidings, the lookout knows that the midnight is passing, and that relief and rest are close at hand. Let the people everywhere take heart of hope, for the cross is bending, the midnight is passing, and joy cometh with the morning. End of statement to the court upon being convicted of violating the Sedition Act by Eugene V. Debs. Read by Winston Tharp.
Selections from The Worn Doorstep by Margaret Pollock Sherwood. Read by Mary in Arkansas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. November 1st. War. Unceasing war in the trenches, with rumors of a British naval defeat in South American waters, and little encouraging news save that the Germans have failed to reach Dunkirk and Calais. England's best are dying. Your kind, England's noblest sons rushing to the danger places, foolishly, grandly brave. One can feel throughout the country a great purpose shaping itself to the needs of the moment, as it does slowly but surely in this land. That is the secret of this people. They can rise to a challenge, meet any crisis whatever when it comes, and though I know that unpreparedness has cost them much, they are greater and better than if they had devoted their best energy for 25 years to getting ready for war. Enthusiasm kindles under the challenge of disaster. The finest have already answered the call. The less fine make the great refusal. You go, but Peter stays, and Peter's kind all over England stays. November 5th. Peter does not stay. Peter is going to the war. For several days he has been very critical of civilization, very severe upon his country and her rulers. At times he seemed to think himself the only real pillar of church and state. Some struggle was going on within him. I have learned enough of him to know that if he expresses a feeling, it is one he does not have. For him, as for me, the horror of the present moment has been intensified by coming into contact with those who have actually suffered. All that I could understand of Henri Dupre's account I have translated into English for Peter's benefit, and the sight of the bullet-riddled hat has plunged him in deep thought. He saw your picture, the picture of you in khaki. Madge, unpermitted, had taken it into the kitchen to polish the frame of oak. Peter looked at it uneasily. "A friend of yours, miss?" "Yes, Peter." "At the front, ma'am?" "At the front, Peter," I answered. I could not have said anything else, and even if I lived to be 100, I shall not think of you any other way except as at the front, fighting if need be, carrying messages across the danger zone with no thought of danger. It was a great advance in Peter to admit the existence of a front. He has persisted in declaring the war a bit of sensational romance devised by the House of Lords for their own entertainment. It was a brooding Peter who busied himself with rubbing up the knives. He has been unusually attentive to Madge since her escapade. His mind seemed to be running on troubles greater than his own. "Do you know where our army is supposed to be now, Mum?" he asked when I told him we had no good news from the seat of war. Our army. We were getting on. I gave him my best information about our hard-pressed line in the west. "It's astonishing that those Germans are able to fight at all, Mum, when they have once met the British," said Peter gloomily, polishing a huge carving knife as if it were a sword. "Meeting the French, that is different. They are a flighty people and very excitable." "Your knowledge of history needs to be brought up to date, Peter," I ventured. "Anything less flighty than that magnificent people of France at this present moment the world has never seen." "It must be very difficult, ma'am, fighting on the continent for one who does not speak the foreign tongues. And I couldn't eat frogs, ma'am. I'd almost rather 'ave the Germans as allies. Sausages aren't as bad as frogs by half." Later I heard him muttering to himself. "If the House of Lords is really in trouble," said Peter, finding the great fight with self, "if the House of Lords really needs me, of course the throne is more or less a figurehead, but I shouldn't like to see it fall just now, especially if the enemy is coming. I should like to impress them as much as possible." It was when he was sweeping the walk that I heard him say, "And I should like to see Bobs once more." But one day determined Peter's future destiny and his rank as a man and a Briton. Peter had gone to the coast with Puck and the cart, spending the night at his sister's on the way. He had some business at Yarmouth, he said. I devised some errands for him and encouraged his going. I thought that it would perhaps prove to be his farewell to his sister before going to war. Those were strange days, the days of Peter's absence, tense, full of nameless anxiety. That early morning feeling of suspense, of expectancy, lasted into the afternoon, and one early morning had brought us the unmistakable sound of guns from the sea. Peter came rattling home in the late afternoon, a pale, distraught Peter, who seemed to have lost several pounds. He came into the garden where I was tying up rose bushes for the winter. At first he seemed unable to speak, but at last gasped out, "Those Germans!" and the gasp ended in a little sob. As I watched him, I found myself sharing his trembling indignation. "German ships, ma'am, men of war, standing off our coast, bombarding. It has never been attacked before. I saw them with my own eyes. I heard them with my own ears." The firing, then, had had the significance that we dreaded. It began at about 7 o'clock in the morning on November 3rd, terrifying the peaceful folk of the seacoast town, shell after shell, report after report, for nearly an hour. Peter, who was getting an early start for home, had taken Puck and the cart to a house on the outskirts of the town, where he was getting a bag of very superior fertilizer. Then came the great noise and the splashing. Little, if any, actual damage was done to buildings or to people. Yet Peter contended that Puck was actually struck on the shoulder by some fragment of splintering wood or flying stone dislodged by a shell. Those shells may have missed their intended mark, but they went home to the heart of the time-expired man, Peter Snell. He knew at last that there was a war, and I knew, what he himself had not yet realized, that he was going to it. Peter lacks descriptive powers. I got from him little idea of the actual scene and all the fright and confusion. When he had found that there was nothing he could do to help, he had sped toward home, intent on carrying out his unavowed purpose. Asking how Puck, now standing with drooping head at the gate, had behaved at the crisis, I got the account that I expected. and as we petted this veteran of the war and dressed a small herd on his shoulder, I heard how he, the most antic pony in the British Isles, had held his ground, had jumped only moderately, had endured the crashing and the splashing, standing with his 4 legs braced in the sand, trembling all over, while Peter, dazed a bit at first, came to his senses. And I will say, ma'am, that he showed more ed than I had myself, for the reins were loose on his back. I haven't dropped them to put in the bag of fertilizer. He never offered to run, ma'am. Puck, the war veteran, took our praises modestly, making no claim to be recognized as a hero. He helps me understand the British temper, not to say the British Constitution. No paper theories for him. The unwritten law of common sense, available when needed, is admirably embodied in him. That power of keeping your head while others lose theirs is what wins in the long run. And despite the discouragement of this present moment, I feel confident that the English will win in the end. The Germans plan, theorize, show great forethought, but are lost without a program. Life does not go by plans and charts. No known precautions can foresee its emergencies. Unless some chemical or electric invention of the Teutons can remove the element of uncertainty from existence, surely victory will go to the people who can meet the unforeseen, pull themselves together, and know, without forethought, what to do in an instant's danger. All these meditations passed through my head as Puck shook his mane, making light of his adventures, and trotted away down the street to his stable with an unmistakable air of England expects every pony to do his duty. The country thrills with indignation, surprise, and increasing resolution. The impossible has happened, and those inviolate shores have been desecrated by attack. Peter is away, Peter in khaki, with something already gone from his laggard step, with firmer and more self-respecting tread, recalling the old training which he was beginning to forget. Surely, because of his experience as a soldier, they will let him go soon to the front. The sympathy and admiration in the eyes of our fugitives have nerved him, as nothing else has done, for the great adventure. I heard Henri giving him some French lessons, strictly along the line of requests for food and drink. The French will make up in swiftness of understanding what he lacks in pronunciation. His last days with Madge have been funny and tragic, too. Her first remark on hearing of the Yarmouth incident was along the old line of urging him to war. Some minds, she remarked firmly, need shot and shell to open 'em. But I could not help noticing that when he began to talk about going, she stopped talking about it. Her face has been tragically comic as she watched him in a Falstaff He That Died a Wednesday mood, packing his belongings. I heard the sound of loud sobbing in the kitchen as she made herself a cup of tea the afternoon he went away. Could it be Madge who was muttering questions as to why the king didn't go to war himself if he wanted war? June 15th. Peter. Can it be Peter, with that expression upon his face? He is really here, and a transfiguring look of suffering has worn away forever a something of earth and of stubbornness. A Peter who seems to have gained greatly in strength and in stature, although one arm is gone, and an empty sleeve hangs by his side. If I had known how to salute, I should have saluted Peter when I saw him home from the war. Mentally, I do it whenever I see him working with his one poor hand in my garden beds. One of the first things he said to me when he came home, that he was going to Shepperton to try to get work that a one-armed man could do, selling papers or something of the kind. But Peter, who has faced the enemy and the poisonous gases, flinched before my countenance when I heard this. Peter knows now that the little red house and the garden can never get on without him. It is odd to see the animals with him. Don cannot be attentive enough, but you would expect a dog to understand. Puck is a wonder, standing as meekly as a lamb to let himself be harnessed by a one-armed man, though he used to dance an ancient British war dance as the straps went on. The old racial love of fair fighting shines out in him. Man to man it used to be, or man to pony when both were able-bodied, but he will take no advantage of a handicap. He seldom shies now, even at a feather or a floating leaf, but he watches constantly in every direction, waiting for some great danger in which he can comport himself with perfect self-control for the sake of a one-armed man, defying the whole modern era to invent a mechanism that can frighten him. I should like an equestrian statue of Puck not shying at a zeppelin. Madge is pathetic. She has lost her old moorings of prejudice and conviction, and sails in an uncharted sea of life. Church and state are to her only a shade less reprehensible than the Germans, since Peter came home without an arm. While Peter, completely changed and loyal to the government, for the country he has served so well is his country indeed, sits with her on the bench by the kitchen door in the twilight, full of affectionate talk of Kitchener and Bobs. His grief over Lord Robert's death was both sincere and personal. Madge mutters fiercely against the House of Lords for its selfishness and its incompetence. If women ruled, all would be different. Her condemnation of the government would suggest that she is, in a fair way, to become both an anarchist and a suffragette. She never would have let Peter go a step to war if she had supposed that he would be wounded. Peter came home not with a Victoria Cross, but with an Iron Cross. And I can never tell whether he is joking or in earnest when he explains his possession of it. When I asked him how he got it, he replied, "I bestowed it upon myself, miss." It seems that he had taken it from a German with whom he had fought in a terrible bayonet charge. He was a man, he was, Peter says admiringly. If I got the better of the man who had earned it, it stands to reason that I'm a better man than him and fit to wear it. So Peter wears his Iron Cross, to the wonder and admiration of the farmers baiting their horses at the inn, the blacksmith's 11 children, and the inhabitants in general of our village. How much he tells those eager listeners of the horrors he has seen, I do not know. But sometimes from that bench by the kitchen door, I hear fragments of his tales of suffering that makes me sick and faint. Yet he is very reticent in regard to it, having evidently a feeling that he must protect others from knowing what he has known. As I make his acquaintance anew, I realize that his great loss is truly exceeding gain. There is more of his real self in his wakened mind and soul than he lost in his arm. But Peter, invalided home, returned not alone. It seemed to me as he came up the walk that he was over heavily weighed down by luggage, though he had a brother soldier to help him. "If you please, mum," said Peter diffidently when our first greetings were over, "I've taken the liberty of bringing someone home." "Nothing could please me better," I said, holding out a welcoming hand to the tall soldier at his side. "If you please, mum," said Peter, grinning, if heroes can be said to grin, "she's inside." He opened the big old-fashioned basket he was carrying, made of osier, a kind I remember seeing in my grandmother's attic many years ago, and there, oh, Pharaoh's daughter, how I understand you now, was a little child of perhaps 10 months, asleep. She had soft dark hair, hands a bit too thin for a baby, eyes that proved to be, when she wakened and opened them, big and brown, and a mouth that had learned, and not forgotten, like so many sorrowful mouths today, how to smile. "Where did you find her?" Madge and I cried out in one breath. "She was in the village where I was taken when I was wounded. You will excuse me, mum. But I cannot say its name. I really cannot. A woman had taken charge of her for weeks. She had been found quite deserted by the roadside. I believe, mum, earlier in the war, when people were trying to escape from the enemy. The nurse used to bring her into the hospital just to let the soldiers see her." Peter was disappointed that I could not speak, but speak I could not. "She's a French baby, mum," he added. "I took a great fancy to her. And when I came away, I told them." "What did you tell them, Peter?" I asked sternly. The little thing had grasped my finger and was trying to pull herself up. It was the first touch of any of my fugitives that seemed to come from my very own, and I knew that the French baby had come into my life to stay. "Knowing your abbots, miss, I told them I thought I knew a good home for her. So they sent her on with a nurse who was coming back, reserved for me, as it were. They kindly allowed me to bring her down from London myself, but I had difficulty in holding her, so I took out me clothes and put them in a paper, and she fitted very nicely in the basket." Peter still mistook my silence for hesitation. "I thought if you didn't care to adopt her, I would, ma'am. But from what they told me about her clothing and all, and from the look of her, I fancied she's rather your class than mine, mum." "I couldn't aspire to your class, Peter," I said. "You belong to the heroes. We will all adopt her. You, Madge, and I, and Don and Puck and the Atom and our English queens. Among us all, she will get a well-rounded training." End of selection from The Worn Doorstep.
Masks and Faces from The Happy Hospital by Ward Muir. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. An English war hospital, on the whole, furnishes forth fewer horrible sights than happy ones. But there is one perturbing experience, which, for the worker in such an institution, is inevitable. It is this: he finds that he must fraternize with fellow men at whom he cannot look without the grievous risk of betraying, by his expression, how awful is their appearance. Myself, I confess that this discovery came as a surprise. I had not known before how usual and necessary a thing it is in human intercourse to gaze straight at anybody to whom one is speaking, and to gaze with no embarrassment. Now, I never felt any embarrassment in thus amicably confronting a patient, however deplorable his state, however humiliating his dependence on my services, until I came in contact with certain wounds of the face. And even these, when still at the stage of requiring to be dressed and bandaged, did not repel. When the wound was healed, however, and the patient was going about with his wrecked face uncovered, I was sometimes sensible of the embarrassment to which allusion has been made. I feared, when talking to him, to meet his eye. Generally there is only one eye left. I feared that inadvertently I might let the poor victim perceive what I perceived, namely, that he was hideous. Hideous is the only word for these smashed faces. The socket, with some twisted moist slit, with a lash or two adhering feebly, which is all that is traceable of the forfeited eye. The skewed mouth, which sometimes, in spite of brilliant dentistry contrivances, results from the loss of a segment of jaw, and worse, far the worst, the incredibly brutalizing effects which are the consequence of wounds in the nose, and which reach a climax of mournful grotesquerie when the nose is missing altogether. To talk to a lad who 6 months ago was probably a wholesome and pleasing specimen of English youth, and is now a gargoyle, and a broken gargoyle at that, the only decent features remaining being perhaps one eye, one ear, and a shock of boyish hair, is something of an ordeal. You know very well that he has examined himself in a mirror. That one eye of his has contemplated the mangled mess which is his face, all the more hopeless because healed. He has seen himself without a nose. Skilled skin grafting has reconstructed a something which owns 2 small orifices that are his nostrils, but the something is emphatically not a nose. He is aware of just what he looks like. Therefore you feel intensely that he is aware that you are aware, and that some unguarded glance of yours may cause him hurt. This, then, is the patient at whom you are afraid to gaze unflinchingly. Not afraid for yourself, but afraid for him. Such a patient must be the more disappointed when he is first allowed to use a mirror, if he has undergone a sequence of laborious operations which have improved his features from what they were. The signs of the improvement are far to seek. That, I fear, must be his preliminary impression when he regards the upshot of wonderful skin grafting, bone transplanting, injection of wax, and all the other marvels of the surgeon's acumen. Without this series of masterly cuttings and manipulations, he would have died, or perhaps would have lost the sight of his surviving eye, or perhaps would have been able to breathe only through his mouth, perhaps would have been prevented from masticating. Without surgery's aid, his face might have been unspeakably worse than it is. He has every reason to bless surgery. And yet, surgery at last has washed its hands of him, and in his mirror he is greeted by a gargoyle. Suppose he is married, or engaged to be married. Could any woman come near that gargoyle without repugnance? His children? Why, a child would run screaming from such a sight. To be fled from by children, that must be a heavy cross for some souls to bear. Well, we have found a way of easing the burden. Here, as in other matters, the war has evoked a creative spirit to combat its destructiveness, and mankind is the richer for a notion which in normal times would never probably have blossomed or borne fruit. Yet even in normal times facial disfigurements occur, so that in future the victims of such an accident will profit by the work done on soldiers in this military hospital. Indeed, already, by special permission, civilians have made pilgrimages to be treated here, civilians who long before the war were disfigured, and now, thanks to the war, can walk the world unabashed. One of these, a woman, had for years worn a thick, practically opaque veil. A rodent ulcer had been removed from the middle of her face, and the hiatus which it left was appalling. Now she has a nose, cheeks, and a mouth. We may look at her photographs before and after. They must be seen to be believed. It suffices that the after owns the countenance of a woman, a trifle expressionless, but still a woman, whereas the before... But these are some things which quite literally and in every sense cannot be described. Let me take the reader into the Masks for Facial Disfigurements department at the 3rd London General Hospital. Tommy Atkins, facetious here as elsewhere, calls it the Tin Noses shop. His joke is far from being a sneer, as you will learn if you find him being accommodated with a tin nose. For tin noses are not easily come by if they are to bear the remotest resemblance to actual ones. And the tin noses, which are not tin, by the way, supplied at this war hospital, resemble the real with a closeness that when you have examined the fraud is almost comical. And there are other delicate frauds as well as the tin nose, the tin cheek, for instance, and the tin eyebrow, and even the tin ear. Of these more anon. Comical or no, the so-called masks are not devoid of beauty, the beauty of a fine idea finely materialized. The idea, and also its materialization, are to the credit of one man, Francis Derwent Wood, A.R.A., the sculptor. In May 1915, he enlisted as a private in the R.A.M.C., and, like his comrades, was promptly put to washing dishes and doing other ward-orderly chores. The present writer washed dishes with Derwent Wood, and to the best of his recollection, Derwent Wood was quite an efficient washer of dishes. There are artists whose art can conceivably find no appropriate application in war, and who are therefore content to wash dishes, indeed proud to do any task, however humble, in the nation's great need. Others there are whose talents are wasted because the powers that be are blind or unimaginative. Private Wood was an exception in both respects. His art has shown itself war-useful, if a much-needed word may be coined, and his commanding officer has been wise enough to encourage it, thereby rendering the community a service not always received from commanding officers similarly situated in regard to unusually gifted men in their employ. Private Wood's tentative suggestions, that is to say, were listened to, not pooh-poohed. He was promoted in due course from the errand-boy housemaid career of a ward orderly, and given a free hand to make a new type of splint, daintily wrought to the patient's arm, leg, back, or whatever it might be, the said arm, leg, or back being first of all cast in plaster of Paris. These casts and splints, in the perfection of their craftsmanship, betrayed the sculptor's trained hand. Presently Derwent Wood was a sergeant in charge of the splint room. That same room still sees the evolution of remarkable splints. But its forte is dealing with facial wounds. It is now the Masks for Facial Disfigurements department, and its creator and director is no longer Sergeant but Captain Derwent Wood of the General Service. The room, divided by a partition, is half a workshop and half a studio. In the workshop we encounter a lance corporal who, as a civilian, was a sculptor's moulder by trade, a job not learnt in a day. He presides over a bench, a litter of esoteric implements, a bag of plaster of Paris, some plasticine, a sink, and a geyser for hot water. In the studio we find the sculptor, but a sculptor attired as a captain of the British Army, and likewise some of his odd sculptures, frail little painted bits of human visages, some with neat mustaches and pairs of spectacles attached to them, and on the walls a frieze of souvenirs in the shape of casts of those same visages, with photographs of their owners in the flesh, the before and after recordings, which so promptly demolish the criticisms of the theorizing objector. What exactly happens to the man who goes into that room with a gargoyle face, and a week or two later, after various processes, is able to emerge with a face which at a few yards' distance is almost a replica of the one he wore before he was wounded? To begin with, it must be explained that the sculptor does nothing whatever unless the surgeon has finished with the case. The wound must be radically healed. It is useless for the sculptor to tackle it if further shrinkage is going to alter its contours. When the healing is pronounced complete, the man can be turned over to the Masks for Facial Disfigurements expert, not before. He enters the room, is seated in a chair, and very carefully scrutinized. He has been asked to supply, if possible, a portrait of himself as he was before he went to the front. Generally he can do so. That last photograph which the wife or sweetheart coaxed him to endure develops an unforeseen value, and this portrait guides the sculptor in some of the factors he must weigh in deciding what type of mask is best suited to the individual. Later, too, the portrait will be of priceless help in the mask's finishing touches. The decision arrived at, the patient's face is prepared for molding. He has lost, perhaps, one eye, a slice of the adjacent cheek, and the top part of the nose. In such a case, the whole of the upper half of the face, including the entire nose and the surviving eye, must be molded. It is first painted over with oil, the eyebrows are smeared with Vaseline, the mustache, if any, receives the same treatment. This is to prevent the plaster of Paris, which is about to be applied, from sticking to the hairs. Meanwhile, our lance corporal has been deftly mixing the plaster of Paris with warm water in a bowl, a minor preparation which nevertheless demands a craftsman's knowledge, for this substance's behavior is fickle. Soon it is of the proper consistency, and the patient, leaning back in his chair as though on the point of being shaved at a barber's, closes his one remaining eye, and has a snippet of tissue paper placed on its oily lid to protect it. A similar snippet protects the hole which once contained the other eye. Quickly a film of plaster is brushed onto the face. Heavier dollops of plaster are applied to this film. Soon the face looks as though its upper features had been very richly lathered. The lather grows thicker and thicker, more and more solid, drier and drier. At length the correct moment, as recognized by the lance corporal, has arrived, and he detaches and lifts off from the patient's face a faintly steaming shell of plaster, the inner surface of which is a negative replica of the gargoyle which is to be restored to naturalness. A minute later, the gargoyle's owner, none the worse, has had all the oil sponged off and is ready to go back to his ward, or to his home, until he shall be required to pay his next visit. After various adventures have befallen it, in which soft soap and soaking plays a part, the plaster of Paris negative yields a plaster of Paris positive. This positive has its few imperfections, minute lumps and the like, smoothed off. Then another negative is made from it. From this second negative, a squeeze of plasticine is taken. Why the technical name for these sometimes rather beautiful and bust-like works should be such an ungainly one as squeeze, I know not, but squeezes they are, and when you go into the masks for facial disfigurements room, it is rarely that you will not find a squeeze being labored upon by the presiding genius of the place. It is upon this squeeze, in the first instance, that the sculptor exercises his art. The squeeze, as it stands, is a literal portrait of the patient, with his eyeless socket, the cheek partly gone, the bridge of the nose missing, and also with his good eye and a portion of his good cheek. These undamaged features were purposely included in the original cast, for these are what the damaged ones must be made to match. But the eye is closed. Its lid was, of course, lowered to shield it from the plaster. We remember that a morsel of tissue paper further shrouded it. The plasticine squeeze, then, represents a face lacking one eye and with the other eye shut. The shut eye must be opened so that the other eye, the eye to be, can be matched to it. With dexterous strokes, the sculptor opens the eye. The squeeze, hitherto representing a face asleep, seems to awaken. The eye looks forth at the world with intelligence. This opening of the closed eye is practically the sole function of the squeeze. From the squeeze, thus modified, a further plaster of Paris cast is made, a negative, and then a positive. This last positive is the basis for the sculptor's main task. On it, working with minute and elaborate finesse, he builds up the patient's portrait. The eyeless socket is filled in and given an eye, eyebrow, and eyelashes, which pair with their neighbors. The concave cheek is made convex to pair with the good cheek. The nose is restored, its shape reproduced from measurements and from comparison with the photograph or photographs. It comes to pass in the fullness of time that a plaster likeness emerges of the man, not as he is, but as he was, and from this sculptured plaster portrait the eventual mask is forged. The mask, so called, when it gets its preliminary adjustments on the patient himself, perhaps does not appear very promising. It is a thin metal contrivance, an electrotype plate, 1/32 of an inch thick, which bears a remote resemblance to an irregular bit cut out of one of those papier-mâché visors worn by revellers at a fancy dress ball. As yet it is not tinted, it is only shaped, and shaped with notable nicety. It exhibits an oval aperture where the eye is to come. Adjacent thereunto is the upper part of the nose. At the side we see restored the lost slope of the cheek. Very, very painstakingly is the patient fitted. Then the plate is covered with an electric deposit of silver. Meanwhile the sculptor, turned painter for the moment, is painting on a slim oval disc of glass an eye which is an adroit reproduction, down even to the veins in the white, of the patient's undamaged eye. This disc will be accommodated in the oval aperture left for it. Commercial artificial eyes were tried, but faultless paring, and the masks for facial disfigurements department is fanatically particular, was seldom achieved, so the painted discs hold the field. Lastly, the silvered disc itself is painted. Oil paints are used, this after diligent investigations into the possibilities of fired enamels, and the patient's sound skin is matched with as microscopic precision as was his sound eye. Eyelashes of metallic foil, real hair has been tried and abandoned, are fixed above the eye. These and the eyebrow are painted, brown, black, or whatever the patient's color may be. Spectacles are soldered to the mask's fragment of nose. These spectacles are not to enable the patient to see, but to hold the mask in place, an office unobtrusively performed by the spectacles' hooks behind the ears. The mask is so light that it needs little support. With some of the smaller ones, spirit gum suffices. Generally speaking, when the patient is wearing his mask, the only difference which his friends can observe in him at a couple of yards' distance are 1. that whereas before the war he had no occasion to wear glasses, he now does wear them, and 2, that he occasionally squints. This latter apparent phenomenon is of course due to the fact that the mask's eye is immovable while the sound eye shifts from side to side. But as long as the patient in talking remembers to look directly at his vis-a-vis, no seeming squint occurs. The sole abnormality is that one eye winks and the other does not. This and the squint the spectacles partly conceal. It is difficult to convey a fair impression of the extraordinary thousandth of an inch sort of correctitude with which these membrane-like but strong metal masks adhere to the face and cover the grisly gap beneath them. At a slight distance, so harmonious are both the moulding and the tinting that it is impossible to detect the join where the live skin of cheek or nose leaves off and the imitation complexion of the mask begins. Figure what this means to the patient. Instead of being a gargoyle, ashamed to show himself on the streets, he is an almost normal human being, and can go anywhere unafraid. Unafraid, a happy release of seeing others afraid. Self-respect returns to him, his depression departs. With this improvement in mental health, there is a corresponding improvement, as no psychologist will need to be told, in physical health likewise. And should it have happened that his wound has injured the nerves controlling the salivary glands or the tear ducts, so that he is troubled by a constant discharge, the sculptor's mask is a blessing, for an absorbent pad can be conveniently tucked away within it, and will be a comfort to the patient in his distressing affliction. The before and after photographs which line the studio walls do not therefore tell the whole of the story. They show us macabre and sometimes brutish physiognomies, metamorphosed into sane and reasonable ones, but they cannot register the access of cheeriness which has been brought about within the brains which those facades hide. Some hint of it is indirectly conveyed by certain of the after portraits, to be sure, and is rather more noticeable in the profiles than in those which are full face. 4 photographs are taken of each patient, 1 full face and 1 profile before, 1 full face and 1 profile after. The profile which is noseless, or has been deprived of all but a portion of the nose, or is lacking the upper lip, is pathetically ugly. Such a profile, wearing the moulded mask which restores these features, has no ugliness whatever, and is frequently even expressive. When the upper lip is gone, its absence is screened by a false mustache hung beneath the artificial nose. This false mustache is made to imitate the mustache which the patient boasted before the war if he was a mustache wearer. One owner of a mustachioed mask of this type is so proud of it, in spite of its falseness, that he waxes and twists it in a fashion sprucely dandaical, and would not be offended if told that he is now a handsomer man than he was when he joined the army. Certainly his 2 after portraits suggest that this is not impossible, they are so spick and span. In another frame we see pictures of a soldier who had completely lost one ear. An elegant false ear in painted metal like the masks, and as imponderable as a feather, has been created for him by Captain Derwent Wood. This ear is attached by spirit gum. You would not think that the loss of an ear could matter much. With longish hair brushed over the place, no decline in comeliness should have ensued. Nevertheless, there is a blank in the full face before portrait, and when we examine the full face after portrait with its 2 ears, of which we can scarcely tell which is the spurious one, we descry at once an added intelligence. The wrongness is exorcised, and the face has returned to a pleasant rightness instead. The very eyes have become in some queer way straighter and more tranquil. All this is brought about by a very close union between craftsmanship and art. The Masks for Facial Disfigurements department, which is intensely practical and materialistic, would not have evolved and could not be conducted by anyone but a sculptor. Those oddly shaped flakes of painted metal do not perhaps define themselves very ostensibly as sculpture pure and simple, but they are based on the formulae and practice of sculpture, and grow from the deftness of the sculptor's hand. With training, anybody might in time make the plaster of Paris molds, and advance as far as the plasticine squeeze. It is in the alterations and adaptations, the buildings up and trimmings down, and the ultimate reproduction of the human face as it was, that the person who does not happen to be a sculptor, and a sculptor of imagination, would inevitably fail. In the masks for facial disfigurements department, there is no parallel to be drawn with any other branch of the war hospital's activities. There is no surgery, and nothing the least like surgery, no medicine, and nothing the least like medicine, no treatment of the face or jaw, as in, say, massage or dentistry, no treatment, in short, of any description whatsoever. The doctor, the surgeon, the masseur, the dentist, all our specialists, come here to watch a confrère whose work on patients is perhaps the only work in the whole institution which does not on some neutral ground overlap with theirs. This confrère has no degrees like theirs, and is in no remotest sense either their competitor or their rival. He is not an unqualified man pushing into a close corporation of qualified men. He is outside their domain, but they equally are outside his, for they are scientists, and he is simply an artist. End of Masks and Faces from The Happy Hospital by Ward Muir. Read by Maria Kasper.
Merchantmen at Arms, The British Merchant Service in the War by David W. Bone. Independent Sailings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Independent Sailings. Until nearly 3 years of war had gone on, we sailed independently as single ships, setting our speeds and courses and conforming only to the general route instructions of the Admiralty. The submarine menace did not come upon us in a sudden intensity. Its operation was gradually unfolded, and countermeasures were as methodically advanced to meet it. The earliest precaution took the form of a wide separation of the ships, branching the sea routes apart on the sound theory that submarines would have voyaging to do to reach their victims. While this was a plan of value on the high seas, it could not be pursued in the narrow waters of the channels. Destroyers in sufficient numbers not being available to patrol these waters, fishing craft, trawlers and drifters, were commissioned to that service. Being of a moderate speed, their activities were not devoted to a mass operation, by which they could group the merchantmen together for protection. The custom was still to separate them as widely as possible, each zigzagging on her own plan. Until the convoy system was established, measures for our protection did not take the form of naval escorts sailing in our company. Such vessels were only provided for transports or for ships on military service. Vessels on commercial voyages were largely left to their own resources when clear of harbour limits. That all sea-going vessels should carry a wireless installation was one of the first measures enforced by Admiralty. The magnificent resources of the Marconi Company, though strained, were equal to the task. There was a life-labour alone in the technical education of their operators, but they drilled the essentials of their practice into landward youths in a few months, blessed them with a probationer's licence, and sent them to sea. It is idle to speculate on what we could have done without this communication with the beach. It is inconceivable that we could have served the sea as we have done. Throughout the length of Channel waters we were constantly in visual touch with the patrols, but in the more open seas we relied on the wireless to keep us informed of enemy activities. At first we were lavish in its use. The air was scored by messages. Backchat was indulged in by the operators. An SOS, and they were frequent, was instant signal for a confusion of inquiries that often prevented the ready succour of a vessel in distress. We grew wiser. We put a seal on the switch. Regulations came into force to restrain unnecessary sparking. We sat in to listen and record, and only to speak when we were spoken to. Codes were issued by the Admiralty for use at sea. Their early cryptogram was easily decoded by friend and enemy alike. Knowing that certain words would assuredly be embodied in the text of a message, Words such as from, latitude, report, submarine, master. It was not difficult to decipher a code of alphabetical sequence. There were famous stories of traitors and spies, but our authoritative simplicity was responsible for the occasional leakage of information. At this date, 1915-16, wireless position detectors came into use by the enemy. A spark group, repeated after an interval, could give a fair approximation of distance and course and speed. More than ever it was necessary to maintain silence when at sea. Withal, the air was still in strong voice. At regular periods the great longshore radios threw out war warnings to guide us in a choice of routes and warn us away from mined areas. Patrols and warcraft kept up an incessant linking report. Distress signals hissed into the atmosphere in urgent sibilance, then faltered and died away. On occasion the high note of a telefunken set invited a revealing confidence that would lead us, chicky, to the block. We were well served by Marconi. Extension of the power of enemy submarines brought new practice to our seafaring. We had made the most of a passage by the land, steering so close that the workers in the field paused in their toil and waved us on. But the new underwater craft crept in as close and mined the fairways. We were ordered to open sea again, to steer the shortest course by which we could reach a depth of water that could not be mined. Zigzag progress now assumed the importance that was ever its right. It had been but cursorily maintained. The shortest distance between 2 points had, for so long, been our rule that many masters were unwilling to steer in tangents. On passage in the more open sea, they were soon converted to a belief in the efficacy of a crazy course. Statistics of our losses proved the virtue of the tangent. Of a group of 6 vessels sunk in a certain area, only one, a very slow vessel, was torpedoed while maintaining a zigzag. Extracts from the diary of a captured submarine commander were circulated among us, giving ground for our confidence in the frequent admissions of failure, owing to a sudden and unexpected alteration of course. Still, we were unarmed. If by zigzag and a keen lookout we were fortunate in evading torpedo attack, the submarine had by now mounted a surface armament, and we were exposed to another equally deadly offence. For our protection, Admiralty placed a new type of warship on the routes approaching the channels. Built originally for duty as minesweepers, the sloops were faster and more heavily armed than the drifters. They patrolled in a chain of 5 or 6 over the routes that we were instructed to use. During the daylight hours, we were rarely out of sight of one or other of the vessels forming the chain. Our route orders were framed towards a definite point of departure into the high seas when darkness came. There the patrol of the sloops ended. We had the hours of the night to make our offing, and, by daybreak again, were assumed to be clear of the danger zone. But the danger zone was being extended swiftly. It was not always possible to traverse the area in the dark hours of a night. Only the fast liners could stretch out a speed that would serve. Profiting by experience that was constantly growing, the Reichsmarine constructed larger submarines capable of remaining long at sea and of operating in ocean areas that could not adequately be patrolled. 12, 15, then 20 degrees of longitude marked their activity advancing to the westward. They went south to 35. In time the Mediterranean became a field for their efforts. Gunfire being the least expensive, they relied on their deck armament to destroy unarmed shipping. The patrols were but rarely in sight. The submarine became a surface destroyer. There was no necessity for submergence on the ocean routes. Underwater tactics were held in reserve for use against fast ships. The slower merchantmen were brought to in a contest that was wholly in favour of the U-boat. In a heavy Atlantic gale, Cabotia was sunk by gunfire 120 miles from land. She had not the speed to escape. Despite the heavy seas that swept over the submarine and all but washed the gunner from the deck, the enemy was able to keep up a galling fire that ultimately forced the master to abandon his ship. Virginia was fired upon at midnight when steering for the Cerigo Channel. Notwithstanding the courage of Captain Coverley, who remained on board to the last, there could be but one end to the contest. Virginia was sunk. A strong ship, the enemy had to expend 2 of his torpedoes to destroy her. Against such attacks, only one measure could be advocated, the measure we had for so long been demanding. It was impossible to patrol adequately all the areas of our voyaging. Guns were served to us, and we derived a confidence that the enemy quickly appreciated. We did not expect wholly to reduce his surface action, but we could and did expose him to the risk he had come so far out to sea to avoid. On countless occasions our new armament had effect in keeping him to his depths, with the consequent waste of his mobile battery power. Even in gun action he could no longer impose his own speed power on a slow ship. Under conditions that he judged favourable to his gunnery, the submarine commander still exercised his ordnance, usually after a torpedo had failed to reach its mark. Many of the hazards were against us, but our weapons brought the contest to a less unequal balance. If we did present the larger target, we had in our steady emplacement a better platform from which to direct our fire. From the first it was a competition of range and calibre. 6-pounders led to 12s, these in turn gave way to 4.7s. Anon the enemy mounted a heavier weapon, to which we replied by a new type of 4-inch, sighted to 13,000 yards. Thus armed and equipped, we were in better condition to meet the enemy in our independent sailings. He was again obliged largely to return to the use of his torpedoes, with all the maze of underwater approach that form of attack involved. If outranged in a surface action, we had our smoke-producing apparatus to set up a screen to his shell fire, and that form of defence had the added value of forcing him to proceed at a high and uneconomical speed to press and attack. Some of our gun actions resulted in destruction of a sea pest, but all, however unsuccessful, contributed to lessen his power of offence. Every torpedo fired, every hour of submergence, every knot of speed expended in a chase, was so far a victory for us as to hasten the date when he would be obliged to head back to his base. His chances of survival in that passage through the patrols and the nets and the mines could not be considered as good. End of Merchantmen at Arms, the British Merchant Service in the War, by David W. Bone. Independent Sailings. Recording by Son of the Exiles.
Chapter 8 of The Little Book of the War by Ava March Tappan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to learn how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 8. The United States enters the war. January 1917 had come, and the war had been going on for 2 years and a half. When it first broke out, it was announced in big headlines in the newspapers, and some of us took down atlases to make sure just where Serbia was. But we did not expect the United States to be seriously affected by a little fighting in a remote corner of Europe. When England and France took up arms, the trouble began to seem rather nearer home. But still, we were on the other side of the Atlantic. We had followed Jefferson's advice and avoided European entanglements, and there seemed no reason why we should have anything to do with this one. Therefore, we had issued promptly a proclamation of neutrality. Of course, Americans, as well as people of other nations, had read German books declaring German aims, but we had never taken them seriously. Perhaps one reason was that with our own great country, the blessed land of room enough, and our long lines of seacoast, we could hardly understand the feelings of a rapidly increasing people who felt themselves shut into two narrow boundaries. However that may be, there was certainly one thing which we had not suspected, and this was that German spies were scattered throughout our land. We found that the German government was paying men to place bombs on ships sailing from the United States, to burn our factories, to bring about strikes, and to wreck railroads. These men were also attempting to use the United States as a base from which to outfit steamers to supply German raiders. They were making efforts to induce the Hindus in this country to arouse those of their race in India to rebel against the rule of England. And they were trying to excite the people of India, Mexico, Haiti, and Cuba to hatred of the United States. They planned to involve Japan in their plots. Japan is our friend, and if we treat her fairly, there is no reason to suppose that she will ever be otherwise. But Germany schemed to unite Japan and Mexico against us, their reward to be land in our southwest. Germans living in this country were advised from home to oppose military training and arming so that the United States might be the more easily overcome in case of war. All this was before there was any break between this country and Germany. These things were done partly in revenge for our sales of ammunition, and partly that we might be kept too busy at home to join in the war in Europe if the time should come when we discovered the wisdom of so doing. The German embassy was the head and front of this work. It even issued passports by forging the name of the United States, a particularly dishonorable act, as a foreign minister is regarded as the guest of the country to which he is sent, and is accorded special privileges and courtesies. We learned at last that we must meet bribery, treachery, and crime. Before the beginning of the war, we had felt as kindly toward Germany as toward any other country. But as the months passed, our feelings underwent a change. War is horrible under all conditions, but civilized nations have tried to lessen its terrors by international laws and agreements forbidding certain methods of warfare. Among the forbidden acts are the destruction of private property, the bombardment of undefended towns, and the bombardment of any towns without warning. Injury to churches, art galleries, hospitals, and hospital ships. The use of anything causing unnecessary suffering, such as poison on weapons or in wells, poison gas, or liquid fire. It is forbidden to impose upon any community fines or other penalties for deeds of individuals for which the community is not responsible. All these regulations, and many others, Germany had violated again and again. She had treated her prisoners with cruelty. She had spread germs of disease. In Belgium, Poland, and elsewhere, she had torn many thousands from their families and driven them away into slavery. She had recognized no law but her own will. In great free America, we could hardly believe that such crimes as these could be committed anywhere in the world. When it was proved not only that the charges were true, but that the crimes had been committed not by lawless soldiers, but under strict orders from headquarters, it was impossible not to take sides. What had happened in our own country increased our indignation. Still, we waited, until at last Germany's method of carrying on submarine warfare became unendurable. These were briefly: early in 1915, Germany marked off a large area of the high seas in which she declared she would sink all enemy ships without warning. 3 months later, she sank the Lusitania. 1 year after this, she promised to sink no more vessels without warning. 8 months later, February the 1st, 1917, she declared that she would sink without warning every vessel that she met. This was nothing more nor less than piracy, and it aroused the indignation of the world. Our government had learned before this that the German ambassador, Count von Bernstorff, was at the head of the plots against the United States, and 2 days after the declaration of unrestricted warfare, he was given his passports. This was not declaring war, but it was a threat of war if Germany did not mend her ways. Germany continued in the same course, and 2 months after the departure of Count von Bernstorff, President Wilson stood before Congress, called in special session. He summed up the injuries which Germany had inflicted upon the United States and the efforts of the government to keep the peace. Then he said, "With a profound sense of the solemn and even tragical character of the step I am taking, and of the grave responsibilities which it involves, but in unhesitating obedience to what I deem my constitutional duty, I advise that the Congress declare the recent course of the Imperial German government to be in fact nothing less than war against the government and people of the United States." Congress voted. Resolved, that the state of war between the United States and the Imperial German government, which has thus been thrust upon the United States, is hereby formally declared. We are in this war for the reason which the President stated in just 8 words. The world must be made safe for democracy. The word democracy comes from 2 Greek words meaning people and power, and a democratic government is one in which the people are the source of the power. The United States is a democracy. We choose men to represent us, representatives, senators, and president. But if even the president does not do for the country what the majority think is wise and honorable, we have the right to try him, and if he is proved guilty, to put him out of his office. France, like the United States, is a republic. England is not a republic, but it is a democracy. It has a king, to be sure, but politically he is hardly more than a figurehead. The Prime Minister and his party rule. But if they propose an important measure, and Parliament, chosen by the people, refuses to pass it, they understand this as a broad hint that they are not representing the will of the people. They resign, and another election is held. The government of Italy is much like that of England. Italy has a king and legislature of 2 houses. Its cabinet, like the English Prime Minister and his party, resigns if Parliament refuses to pass any important measures which it has presented. Such is a democratic government, of the people, by the people, and for the people. as Lincoln so well expressed it. The government of Germany is an autocracy. This word comes from two Greek words meaning self and power. That is, the ruler himself, and not the people, is the source of the power. The German Empire was formed, as has been said before, by the union of a number of kingdoms, duchies, free cities, etc. The states of the United States united on equal terms, no state having more privileges or rights than another. The number of representatives which each state sends to Congress depends, as is fair and just, upon the number of the state's inhabitants. But every state, whether large or small, sends 2 senators. The German Union of States is quite different from ours. When it was formed, some states refused to join unless they could have special privileges. Bavaria, for instance, pays no taxes to the empire on beer and domestic liquors. Of all these states, Prussia was by far the strongest, and when her king became also German emperor, she was able to secure whatever special privileges she wanted. The government of Germany consists of the Kaiser, the Chancellor, and 2 houses. The members of one of these, the Bundesrat, are appointed by the rulers of the 25 states, each one having a fixed number of votes. The other, the Reichstag, represents the people, and its members are chosen by the people's votes. At first glance, this seems much like the government of England, with king, prime minister, and the 2 houses of parliament. But there is a great difference, as will be seen later. The Kaiser is, of course, at the head of the government. Under him is the Chancellor, whom he appoints or puts out of office as he chooses. The Chancellor is president of the Bundesrat, and he has also a seat in the Reichstag. In England, as has just been said, if the Prime Minister proposes an important bill and Parliament refuses to make it a law, the Prime Minister resigns. In Germany, if the Chancellor proposes an important bill and the Reichstag refuses to make it a law, the Reichstag may be dissolved and a new election held. This may be done again and again until a Reichstag has been formed that will vote as the Chancellor, that is the Kaiser, wishes, and the Chancellor remains in power until the Kaiser desires to make a change. The Reichstag, then, has almost no power, and is practically, as it has often been called, only a debating club. The Bundesrat represents the states as states, but the number of representatives varies with the different states. There are in all 61 members. Of these, Prussia has 17, while 17 of the states have only 1 apiece. Alsace-Lorraine has 3 votes, but the Kaiser instructs how they shall be cast. The delegates from each state vote as a unit, and as they have been bidden by the prince of their state to vote. Now, the Kaiser is also king of Prussia, so the 20 delegates are subject to his will. The meetings of the Bundesrat are held in secret. If the Reichstag passes a law, it is not valid unless the Bundesrat agrees to it. As the Kaiser controls 1/3 of the votes of the Bundesrat, it is an easy matter for the Chancellor to secure for him enough more votes to make a majority and pass whatever measure he may please. The Kaiser, then, controls both the Reichstag and the Bundesrat. He also controls the army and the navy. To make offensive war, he must ask the assent of the Bundesrat, not difficult to obtain as we have seen. But if, in his own opinion, the war is defensive, all he needs to do is to say, "Let there be war," and the vast war machine of the empire is set in motion. The present war the Kaiser averred to be defensive, and he did not officially notify the Bundesrat until 3 days after it had been declared. As Prussia is the leading state of Germany, it is of interest to know that Prussian voters are divided into 3 classes according to their property. 4% of the wealthy folk of the land count in voting for as much as 82% of the working people, and the vote of one man of wealth or of noble birth may be equal to the votes of 10,000 working men. This is why a junker, that is, son of a noble house which has always been devoted to military service, holds so much power. Bismarck was a junker. The government of the United States, of England, of France, and of Italy is a government of the people by themselves, a democracy. The government of Germany is a government of the people by one person, an autocracy. Lincoln said, "This country cannot endure half slave and half free. Neither can the nations endure half democratic and half autocratic. As long as there is a man in the world who has the power to bring war upon a country simply by saying the world is not safe. That is why we are fighting. Our boys do not cross the ocean to enter European entanglements, but to keep autocracy from our own land. This is our war. We fight to defend our own country and ourselves just as certainly as if German troops had landed on our shores. Paris in 3 weeks, London in 3 months, New York in 3 years was a common saying among German officers. From the beginning of the war, France and England and little Belgium have been fighting our battles. The Atlantic is wide, but if England had not been our friend and had not protected us by keeping the German fleet shut up in the North Sea, who can doubt that Germany would have strained every nerve in the effort to bombard our coast towns and turn parts, at least, of our country into a second Belgium? End of Chapter 8 of The Little Book of the War by Ava March Tappan.
Chapter 11 of Inventions of the Great War by A. Russell Bond. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MaryAnn Spiegel. Chapter 11 Warriors of the Paintbrush. When the great European War broke out, it was very evident that the Entente allies would have to exercise every resource to beat the foe which had been preparing for years to conquer the world. But who ever imagined that geologists would be called in to choose the best places for boring mines under the enemy, that meteorologists would be summoned to forecast the weather and determine the best time to launch an offensive, that psychologists would be employed to pick out the men with the best nerves to man the machine guns and pilot the battle planes? Certainly no one guessed that artists and the makers of stage scenery would play an important part in the conflict. But the airplane filled the sky with eyes that at first made it impossible for an army to conceal its plans from the enemy, and then there were eyes that swam in the sea, cruel eyes that belonged to deadly submarine monsters, eyes that could see without being seen, eyes that could pop up out of the water at unexpected moments, eyes that directed deadly missiles at inoffensive merchantmen. They were cowardly eyes, too, which gave the ship no opportunity to strike back at the unseen enemy. A vessel's only safety lay in the chance that out on the broad reaches of the ocean it might pass beyond the range of those lurking eyes. It was a game of hide-and-seek, in which the pursuer, and not the pursued, was hidden. Something had to be done to conceal the pursued as well, but in the open sea there was nothing to hide behind. Hiding in plain sight. There is such a thing as hiding in plain sight. You can look right at a tree-toad without seeing him, because his colors blend perfectly with the tree to which he clings. You can watch a green leaf curl up and shrivel without realizing that the curled edge is really a caterpillar, cunningly veined and colored to look just like a dying leaf. And out in the woods a speckled bird or striped animal will escape observation just because it matches the spotted light that comes through the underbrush. Nature is constantly protecting its helpless animals with colored coats that blend with surroundings. Long ago, clumsy attempts at concealment were made when war vessels were given a coat of dark gray paint, which was supposed to make them invisible at a distance. Actually, the paint made them more conspicuous, but, then, concealment did not count for very much before the present war. It was the eyes of submarines that brought a hurry call for the artists, and up to them was put the problem of hiding ships in plain sight. A new name was coined for these warriors of the paintbrush. Camoufleurs, they were called, and their work was known as camouflage. Matching the sky. Of course, no paint will make a ship absolutely invisible at a short distance, but a large vessel may be made to disappear completely from view at a distance of 6 or 7 miles if it is properly painted. To be invisible, a ship must reflect as much light and the same shade of light as do its surroundings. If it is seen against the background of the sea, it must be of a bluish or a greenish tint. But a submarine lies so low in the water that any object seen at a distance is silhouetted against the sky, and so the ship must have a coat of paint that will reflect the same color as does the sky. Now, the sky may be of almost any color of the rainbow, depending upon the position of the sun and the amount of vapor or dust in the air. Fortunately, in the North Sea and the waters around the British Isles, where most of the submarine attacks took place, the weather is hazy most of the time, and the ship had to be painted of such color that it would reflect the same light as that reflected by a hazy sky. With a background of haze, and more or less haze between the ship and the periscope of the U-boat, it was not a difficult matter to paint a ship so that it would be invisible 6 or 7 miles away. One shade of gray was used to conceal a ship in the North Sea, and an entirely different shade was used for the brighter skies of the Mediterranean. In this way, the artists made it possible for ships to sail in safety much nearer the pursuer who was trying to find them, and by just so much they reduced his powers of destruction. But still the odds were too heavy against the merchantman. Something must be done for him when he found himself within the 7-mile danger zone. Here again the artists came to the rescue. Before the merchant ships were armed, a submarine would not waste a torpedo on them, but would pound them into submission with shell. Even after ships were provided with guns, submarines mounted heavier guns, and unless a ship was speedy enough to show a clean pair of heels, the pursuing U-boat would stand off out of range of the ship's guns and pour a deadly fire into it. But the ships, too, mounted larger guns, and the submarines had to fall back upon their torpedoes. Getting the range for the torpedo. In order to fire its torpedo with any certainty, the U-boat had to get within 1,000 yards of its victim. A torpedo travels at from 30 to 40 miles per hour. It takes time for it to reach its target, and a target which is moving at, say, 15 knots, will travel 500 yards, while a 30-knot torpedo is making 100 yards. And so before the U-boat commander could discharge his torpedo, he had to know how fast the ship was traveling and how far away it was from him. He could not come to the surface and make deliberate observations, but had to stay under cover, not daring even to keep his eye out of water, for fear that the long wake of foam trailing behind the periscope would give him away. All he could do, then, was to throw his periscope up for a momentary glimpse, and make his calculations very quickly. Then he could move to the position he figured that he should occupy and shoot up his periscope for another glimpse to check his calculations. On the glass of this periscope there were a number of gradations running vertically and horizontally. If he knew his victim and happened to know the height of its smokestacks or the length of the boat, he noted how many gradations they covered, and then, by a set formula, he could tell how far he was from the boat. At the same time, he had to work out its rate of travel and note carefully the course it was holding before he could figure where his torpedo must be aimed. There was always more or less uncertainty about such observations, because they had to be taken hastily, and the camoufleurs were not slow to take advantage of this weakness. They increased the enemy's confusion by painting high bow waves, which made the ship look as if it were traveling at high speed. They painted the bow to look like the stern, and the stern to look like the bow, and the stacks were painted so that they appeared to slant in the opposite direction, so that it would look as if the vessel were headed the other way. U-boats came to have a very wholesome respect for destroyers, and would seldom attack a ship if one of these fast fighting craft was about, and so destroyers were painted on the sides of ships as scarecrows to frighten off the enemy. Making straight lines look crooked. We say that seeing is believing, but it is not very hard to deceive the eye. The lines in Figure 13 look absolutely parallel, and they are, but cross-hatch the spaces between them, with the hatching reversed in alternate spaces, as in Figure 14, and they no longer look straight. Take the letters on the left, Figure 15. They look all higgledy-piggledy, but they are really straight and parallel, as one can prove by laying a straight edge against them, or by drawing a straight line through each letter, as shown to the right, Figure 16. Such illusions were used on ships. Stripes were painted on the hull that tapered slightly from bow to stern, so that the vessel appeared to be headed off at an angle, when it was really broadside to the watcher at the other end of the periscope. There are color illusions, too, that were tried. If you draw a red chalk mark and a blue one on a perfectly clean blackboard, the red line will seem to stand out and the blue one to sink into the black surface of the board, because your eye has to focus differently for the two colors, and a very dazzling effect can be had with alternating squares of blue and red. Other colors give even more dazzling effects, and some of them, when viewed at a distance, will blend into the very shade of gray that will make a boat invisible at 6 miles. When U-boat commanders took observations on a ship painted with a dazzle camouflage, they saw a shimmering image which it was hard for them to measure on the fine gradations of their periscopes. Some ships were painted with heavy blotches of black and white, and the enemy, making a hasty observation, would be apt to focus his attention on the dark masses and overlook the white parts. So he was likely to make a mistake in estimating the height of the smokestack, or in measuring the apparent length of a vessel. A joke on the photographer. Early in the submarine campaign, one of our boats was given a coat of camouflage, and when the vessel sailed from its pier in the North River, New York, the owners sent a photographer 2 or 3 piers down the river to photograph the ship as she went by. He took the picture, but when the negative was developed, much to his astonishment, he found that the boat was not all on the plate. In the finder of his camera, he had mistaken a heavy band of black paint for the stern of the ship, quite overlooking the real stern, which was painted a grayish-white. The artist had fooled the photographer at a distance of not more than 200 or 300 yards. Seeing beyond the horizon. The periscope of a submarine that is running awash can be raised about 15 feet above the water, which means that the horizon as viewed from the elevation is about 6 miles away. And if you draw a circle within a 6-mile radius on the map of the Atlantic, you will find that it is a mere speck in the ocean. But a U-boat commander could see objects that lay far beyond his horizon because he was searching for objects which towered many feet above the water. The smokestacks of some vessels rise 100 feet above the waterline, and the masts reach up to much greater altitudes. Aside from this, in the early days of the war steamers burned soft coal, and their funnels belched forth huge columns of smoke which were visible from 20 to 30 miles away. When this was realized, efforts were made to cut down the superstructure of a ship as much as possible. Some vessels had their stacks cut down almost to the deck line, and air pumps were installed to furnish the draft necessary to keep their furnaces going. They had no masts, except for slender iron pipes which could be folded down against the deck and could be erected at a moment's notice, to carry the aerials of the wireless system. Over the ship, from stem to stern, was stretched a cable familiarly known as a clothesline, upon which were laid strips of canvas that completely covered the superstructure of the ship. These boats lay so low that they could not be seen at any great distance, and it was difficult for the U-boats to find them. They were slow boats, too slow to run away from a modern submarine, but because of their lowly structure, they managed to elude the German U-boats. When they were seen, the U-boat commanders were afraid of them. They were suspicious of anything that looked out of the ordinary, and preferred to let the clothesline ships go. The British mystery ships. The Germans had some very unhealthy experiences with the Q-boats, or mystery ships of the British. These were vessels rigged up much like ordinary tramp steamers, but they were loaded with wood so that they would not sink, and their hatches were arranged to fall open at the touch of a button, exposing powerful guns. They were also equipped with torpedo tubes, so that they could give the U-boat a dose of its own medicine. These ships would travel along the lanes frequented by submarines and invite attack. They would limp along as if they had been injured by a storm or a U-boat attack, and looked like easy prey. When a submarine did attack them, they would send out frantic calls for help, and they had so-called panic parties which took to the boats. Meantime, a picked crew remained aboard, carefully concealed from view, and the captain kept his eye upon the enemy through a periscope disguised as a small ventilator, waiting for the U-boat to come within range of certain destruction. Sometimes the panic party would lure the submarine into a favorable position by rowing under the stern as if to hide around the other side of the ship. At the proper moment, up would go the white ensign, the British man-of-war flag. The batteries would be unmasked, and a hail of shell would break loose over the Hun. Many a German submarine was accounted for by such traps. Submarines themselves used all sorts of camouflage. They were frequently equipped with sails which they would raise to disguise themselves as peaceful sloops, and in this way they were able to steal up on a victim without discovery. Sometimes they would seize a ship and hide behind it in order to get near their prey. Camouflage on land. But the call for wielders of the paintbrush came not only from the sea. Their services were needed fully as much on land, and the making of land camouflage was far more interesting because it was more varied and more successful. Besides, it called for more than mere paint. All sorts of tricks with canvas, grass, and branches were used. Of course, the soldiers were garbed in dust-colored clothing, and shiny armor was discarded. The helmets they wore were covered with a material that cast no gleam of light. In every respect they tried to make themselves of the same shade as their surroundings. Like the Indians, they painted their faces. This was done when they made their raids at night. They painted their faces black so that they would not show the faintest reflection of light. A paper horse. The most interesting camouflage work was done for the benefit of snipers or for observers at listening posts close to the enemy trenches. It was very important to spy on the enemy and discover his plans, and so men were sent out as near his lines as possible to listen to the conversation and to note any signs of unusual activity which would be likely to precede a raid. These men were supplied with telephone wires which they dragged over no man's land, and by which they could communicate their discoveries to headquarters. Some very ingenious listening posts were established. In one case, a papier-mâché duplicate of a dead horse was made, which was an exact facsimile of an animal that had been shot and lay between the two lines. One night, the carcass of the horse was removed and the papier-mâché replica took its place. In the latter a man was stationed with a telephone connection back to his own lines. He had an excellent chance to watch the enemy. On another occasion a standing tree, whose branches had been shot away, was carefully photographed and an exact copy of it made, but with a chamber inside in which an observer could be concealed. One night, while the noise of the workmen was drowned by heavy cannonading, this tree was removed and its facsimile was set up instead, and it remained for many a day before the enemy discovered that it was a fake tree trunk. It proved a tall observation post from which an observer could direct the fire of his own artillery. Fooling the watchers in the sky. In the early stages of the war, it seemed impossible to hide anything from the Germans. They had eyes everywhere and were able to anticipate everything the Allies did. But the spies that infested the sky were the worst handicap. Even when the Allies gained control of the air, the control was more or less nominal because every now and then an enemy observer would slip over or under the patrolling aeroplanes and make photographs of the Allies' lines. The photographs were carefully compared with others previously taken that the slightest change in detail might be observed. Airplane observers not only would be ready to drop bombs on any suspicious object or upon masses of troops moving along the roads, but would telephone back to their artillery to direct its fire upon these targets. Of course, the enemy knew where the roads were located, and a careful watch was kept of them. The French did not try to hide the roads, but they concealed the traffic on the roads by hanging rows of curtains over them. As these curtains hung vertically and were spaced apart, one would suppose that they would furnish little concealment, but they prevented an observer in an aeroplane from looking down the length of a road. All the road he could see was that which lay directly under his machine, because there he could look between the curtains. If he looked obliquely at the road, the curtains would appear to overlap one another and would conceal operations going on under them. In one case, the Germans completely covered a sunken road with canvas painted to represent a road surface. Under this canvas canopy, troops were moved to an important strategic point without the slightest indication of such movement. Hiding big guns. Nature's tricks of camouflage were freely used in hiding the implements of war on land. Our big guns were concealed by being painted with leopard spots and tiger stripes, the color and nature of the camouflage depending upon the station they were to occupy. In many cases they were covered with branches of trees or with rope netting overspread with leaves. So careful was the observation of the air scouts that even the grass scorched by the fire of the gun had to be covered with green canvas to prevent betrayal of the position of the gun. Roads that led nowhere. In the making of an emplacement for a gun, it was of the utmost importance that no fresh upturned earth be disclosed to the aerial observers. Even footpaths leading to it had to be concealed. Plans were carefully made to cover up all traces of the work before the work was begun. Where it was impossible to conceal the paths, they were purposely made to lead well beyond the point where the emplacement was building, and, still further to deceive the enemy, a show of work was sometimes undertaken at the end of the path. Wherever the sod had to be upturned, it was covered over with green canvas. The earth that was removed had to be concealed somewhere, and the best place of concealment was found to be some old shell hole which would hold a great deal of earth without any evidence that would be apparent to an observer in an airplane. If no shell hole were handy, the excavated material had to be hauled for miles before a safe dumping ground could be found. As far as possible, everything was sunk below the earth level. Big pits were dug in which the mortars were placed, or if a shell hole were empty, this was used instead. Shadowless buildings. Any projection above the ground was apt to cast a shadow which would show up on the observer's photographs. This was a difficulty that was experienced in building the hangars for airplanes. The roofs of these sheds were painted green so as to match the sod around them, but as they projected above their surroundings, they cast shadows which made them clearly evident to the enemy. This was overcome by the building of shadowless hangars, that is, hangars with roofs that extended all the way to the ground, at such an angle that they would cause no shadow except when the sun was low. In some places, aeroplanes were housed in underground hangars, the approach to which was concealed by a canvas covering. As for the machines themselves, they scorned the use of camouflage. Paint was little protection to them. Some attempt was made to use transparent wings of ceylon, a material similar to celluloid, but this did not prove a success. The photographic eye. Although camoufleurs made perfect imitations of natural objects and surroundings, they were greatly concerned to find that the flying observers could see through their disguises. To the naked eye, the landscape would not show the slightest trace of any suspicious object. But by use of a color screen to cut out certain rays of light, a big difference would be shown between the real colors of nature and the artist's copies of them. For instance, if a roof painted to look like green grass were viewed through a red color screen, it would look brown, while the real grass, which apparently was of exactly the same shade as the roof, would look red. It had not been realized by the artists, who never studied the composition of light, that there is a great deal of red in the green light reflected by the grass, and that if they were to duplicate this shade of green, they must put a certain amount of red paint in their imitation grass roofs. Air Scouts did not depend upon their eyes alone, but used cameras so that they could study their photographs at their leisure, and by fitting the cameras with different color screens, they could analyze the camouflage and undo the patient work of the artist. A call for the physicist. To meet this situation, another man was summoned to help, the physicist, who looks upon color merely as waves of ether, who can pick any ray of light to pieces just as a chemist can analyze a lump of sugar. Under his expert guidance, colors of nature were imitated so that they would defy detection. Aside from this, the physicist helped to solve the tricks of the enemy's camoufleurs. But the physicist had barely rolled up his sleeves and got into the fray when the armistice was signed, which put an end to the shams as well as to the realities of the Great War. While the work of camouflage was not completed, we owe an inestimable debt to the men who knew how to fake scenery, and to their learned associates who count the wavelengths of light, and although their trade was a trade of deception and shams, there was no sham about the service they rendered. Making ships visible. While in war safety lies in invisibility, in peace the reverse is true. Now that the war is over, it may seem that the work of the camoufleurs can find no useful application. But it was impossible to learn how to make objects invisible without also learning how to make them conspicuously visible. As a consequence, we now know how to paint a ship so that it will show up more clearly in foggy weather, thereby reducing the danger of collision. We know, too, how to paint light ships, buoys, etc., so that they will be much more conspicuous and better guides to mariners, and how to color railroad signals and road signs so that they will be more easily seen by locomotive engineers and automobile drivers. End of Chapter 11 of Inventions of the Great War by A. Russell Bond.